This is a comparison of two ideologies that between them claim more of the galaxy's inhabited worlds than any other force in the 41st millennium, and the comparison has a thesis. Both the Tau Empire and the Imperium of Man make their subjects exactly the same offer, obedience in exchange for survival, and only one of the two actually honors the deal. That is the argument, stated at the top, before any of the evidence, so that you know from the first minute what I am going to try to prove and can spend the rest of the video deciding whether I have. I am not going to tell you the Tau are good. That is a different claim, and I do not believe the record supports it. What I am going to tell you is that when the Tau say the price of admission is your freedom, and the reward is a life without famine, without squalor, without your children being fed into a grinder, they are describing something they measurably deliver. And when the Imperium says the price of admission is your freedom, and the reward is survival, it takes the payment and does not deliver the goods. Before any of that, the method, because a documentary that will not tell you how it knows things is not a documentary, it is a mood. Everything here comes from published Games Workshop material and from Black Library fiction, and those two things are not the same tier of evidence. Codices, rule books and campaign books are corporate documents, cited by exact title and edition and year, and never attributed to a named author, because they do not have one. Novels are cited with author and year, because they do. Licensed role-playing products from Fantasy Flight Games sit one rung below both. Video game material sits below that again. Where those tiers disagree, I will say which one I am standing on. Where the sources contradict each other, this video will say so out loud, rather than quietly picking the version that suits the argument. There is a great deal of contradiction in this material. Games Workshop has rewritten the Tau more than once, sometimes in direct response to what the audience said about them, and I will show you where that happened and what it changed, and where canon simply has no answer, where the setting has a hole in it that has never been filled in over a quarter of a century of publishing. I am going to stop and tell you that it is a hole rather than pour my own speculation into it and hand it back to you as fact. There are at least 3 of those holes in the Tau material alone, and one of them is the single most important question in the faction. So, the Tau. Everything the Tau Empire believes, every institution it built, every world it absorbed, rests on a single remembered catastrophe, and until you understand the catastrophe you cannot understand why an entire species agreed to be governed this way. They call it the Mont'au. It translates as the Terror, and it is also rendered as the Death Age. It refers to the civil war on the Tau homeworld in the closing years of the 37th millennium, before the Ethereals existed, when the 4 proto-castes were not castes at all but mutually hostile tribes. They had been separated long enough and adapted hard enough to their environments that canon describes them as effectively separate subspecies: mountain dwellers, plains hunters, city builders, itinerant traders, and they were, in the setting's own words, being destroyed by war and disease, with extinction as the expected outcome. That is the founding memory, not a golden age, not a lost empire, a species watching itself die by its own hand and assuming the process was finished. Here is where it stops being history and becomes something much stranger, and this is the structural insight that unlocks the entire faction, so I want to slow down for it. Mont'au is not a word the Tau reserve for the past. It is a live word with 3 additional jobs in the present. First, Mont'au is the Tau word for chaos, the ruinous powers, the warp, the enemy that cannot be negotiated with, the thing that eats civilizations from the inside. The Tau did not coin a new term for it. They reached for the name of their own dark age and applied it. The worst thing in the universe and the worst thing they ever did to themselves share a single noun. Second, and this one genuinely rearranged how I read the Tau, Mont'au is a clinical diagnosis applied to individuals. The Tau lexicon defines it as a state of being without progress, without unity or altruism, without direction or purpose or strength. Which means that a Tau who cannot work in a team, a Tau who is simply too individualistic to slot cleanly into a group, is described as being in a state of Mont'au. Personal individualism and civilizational apocalypse are the same word in their language. There is no way to describe wanting to be your own person that does not also invoke the near extinction of the species. Third, it is a standing threat of relapse. The formulation appears in their own material almost as a liturgy. Everything we do must be in the furtherance of the greater good, lest we return to the Mont'au, the terror. That third meaning is the load-bearing beam of the entire Tau project, and it is why comparing them to a utopia misses the point completely. The greater good is not primarily marketed as paradise. It is marketed as the only thing standing between the species and an apocalypse they can still remember, which means dissent is not framed as disagreement. Dissent is framed as relapse. A Tau who argues with the doctrine is not wrong. He is symptomatic. He is not a critic. He is a case. Hold on to that, because when we get to the Imperium in a later movement you are going to see the identical mechanism wearing entirely different clothes. Now the founding legend, which every Tau knows, and whose structure matters more than its content, because it is a conversion narrative told by the converted. On a plateau called Phaeton stood the great fortress city of the builders, the proto-Earth caste, roughly 7,000 of them inside. Outside were the plains warriors and the mountain Tau, the proto-fire and proto-air, laying siege. The traders, the proto-water, tried to negotiate an end to it and failed, and the reason canon gives for their failure is worth quoting because it is not flattering to anybody. The plains warriors' blood was afire though, and they would brook no settlement save that delivered at the end of a rifle. The siege ran 5 seasons, disease inside the walls, starvation inside the walls, nothing moving, and then one night, 2 Tau of unusual appearance appeared simultaneously. One walked into the camp of the besiegers, the other was somehow already inside the fortress, on the other side of a sealed siege line, with no account given of how he got there. Canon describes them as twins in all respects, softly spoken, and possessed of what it calls an undeniable authority. Now read the next detail slowly, because the Tau's own scripture puts it there, and I do not think most people who tell this story notice what it says. The sentries did not choose to grant an audience. The text says they found themselves compelled to escort him. The Castellan did not choose to receive him. The text says the audience could not be denied. The founding myth of the Tau Empire, the version the Tau themselves tell and revere, states in its own words that the obedience of the very first Tau to encounter an Ethereal was involuntary on the part of the people obeying. The seed of every mind control theory anyone has ever floated about this faction is not an imperial slander. It is sitting inside the Tau's own holy story, in the Tau's own telling, and they repeat it as a wonder. By sunrise there was a truce. More Ethereals emerged across the planet in the same period, and the outcome is recorded flatly. Within the space of a Terran year, the wars were over. A civilizational death spiral that had run for generations closed inside 12 months. The tribes were then decreed their elemental names: earth, water, air, fire. 3 things about that founding, and the first is the one that gets missed most often. The Ethereals did not invent the caste system. The divisions were already there, tribal and biological and old. What the Ethereals did was formalize them, name them, freeze them permanently, and supply a moral justification for keeping them frozen. That is a different act than creating a hierarchy. It is the act of taking an accident of history and declaring it a law of nature. The second is a humiliation that is fully canonical and almost never mentioned. Harmony through mutual benefit was the trader's own doctrine. The proto-Wata caste had been arguing exactly that position, and losing. Then 2 strangers walked in and achieved it overnight. Canon says being so effortlessly surpassed in their own field forced the water caste to swallow a considerable amount of pride, and that it took rather longer for them to learn to revere the Ethereals than the rest of their species. The caste of persuaders was the last caste to be persuaded. The professional diplomats held out longest against the new authority, and I would give a great deal to know what they were thinking during those years, because canon never tells us. The third is the first of this video's genuine blanks, and I am going to leave it as a blank. The origin of the Ethereals is unexplained. The phrase used is that they appeared as from nowhere. There is no homeland, no prior history, no account of where a 5th population with distinct anatomy was living during the tens of thousands of years before it walked out of the dark in the middle of an extinction event. 25 years of publishing have not filled that in. I am not going to fill it in either. And then there is the anomaly, which is the strongest in-universe argument that the Ethereals are something other than unusually persuasive politicians. The Tau went from pre-industrial nomads to a star-faring empire in under 6,000 years. For scale, in the same setting, humanity took roughly 10 times that to do it once, and needed to do it more than once. The industrial ramp is described as beginning within only a few Terran years of the Ethereals revealing themselves. Not a generation, not a century, a few years. Canon's entire explanation for this is one sentence. The Ethereals evidently had some part to play in this rapid development. That is it. No mechanism, no technology transfer described, no teaching program, evidently had some part to play. I want to be fair to the ordinary reading here before I lean on the strange one. It is genuinely possible that a species that stops burning its own infrastructure and starts pooling 4 specialized skill sets will accelerate absurdly, and that 6 millennia is simply what happens when nobody wastes anything for 6 millennia. That is not a silly position, but Canon had every opportunity to say that, in plain language, in any of the last 25 years of publishing, and instead it has said evidently had some part to play, every single time. When a setting refuses to close a question that often, the refusal is the content. So that is the wound and the miracle. Now the doctrine that was built on top of them. Aun'Va renders literally as good greater, noun before modifier, the reverse of Gothic word order, and that inversion is not an accident of translation. The canonical definition calls it the founding religio-philosophical principle of Tau society, which is utilitarian in the sense that it holds that all self-aware beings should strive to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number of other intelligent beings in the galaxy. 2 things in that definition do enormous work. The first is that it is explicitly both a religion and a philosophy, not one dressed as the other, both, simultaneously by definition in the source. Every argument you have ever seen about whether the Tau are secular rationalists or a theocracy is answered in the setting's own dictionary entry, and the answer is yes. The second is the scope. All intelligent beings in the galaxy, not all Tau, not all citizens, everyone. That universalism is the engine of every expansion that follows, and it is why the Tau are so much harder to argue with than a straightforwardly greedy empire. They do not conquer you because they want your planet. They conquer you because they believe they owe you the tenets enumerated, because they are innumerable, and it is worth hearing them in order. Utilitarian universalism, the greatest good for the greatest number of intelligent beings in the galaxy. Every self-aware being is equal and plays an essential part, and I will simply note in passing the tension between that sentence and a hereditary caste system, because we are about to spend a long time on the caste system. Subordination of the individual, phrased in canon as no individual is ever considered more important than the needs of the rest of society. Complementarity rather than sameness, unity achieved through specialization rather than through everyone being alike. Expansion as a moral obligation, and the wording there deserves attention, because canon says the utilitarian premise forces the Tau to both desire to expand their empire for the greater good and to absorb other intelligent races, forces, not permits, forces, then necessity rather than faith. The greater good is no mere diversion, no empty godhood in which we place our faith. It is a necessity human, it is the only thing that can save the galaxy from itself. Then the free choice claim, which I think is the most revealing line in the entire doctrine. Each Tau is free to choose their destiny. That they all choose the Tau'va is merely testament to its righteousness. Read that twice. The universal uniformity of the outcome is offered as evidence for the freedom of the choice. That is not an argument. That is a closed loop, and it is presented with total sincerity, and finally inevitability, in the form of a proverb. Orok shothri tixon shatova. Unity comes to all things, in time. When Inquisitor Maturin Rele put the obvious follow-up to a captured Ethereal in Xenology, written by Simon Spurrier, and published by Black Library in 2006, the question was, whether they like it or not. The transcript records the Ethereal's answer as silence. That same interrogation gives us the best in-universe statement of the doctrine anyone has ever produced. Rele asks what the greater good actually is. The Ethereal answers, selflessness, you would call it, the greater good, the knowledge that staring inwards one finds only solitude, but by staring outwards, by devoting oneself to the race and its quest for perfection, there is harmony and peace. Rele presses, an ongoing quest, so you admit your empire is not yet perfect, and the answer is of course not. What is? The Tau'va is the path, Giela, not the destination. The Tova is the path, not the destination. Sit with what that does. It makes the doctrine unfalsifiable. No failure can disprove a road. Every atrocity, every broken promise, every camp, every world that joined and then quietly stopped existing, all of it becomes a stretch of bad surface on a journey that is going somewhere better by definition. You cannot fail a destination you have declined to specify. And the doctrine is not only spoken, it is performed, in blood, and the ritual is where the ideology stops being abstract. The Talisera is a bonding oath, sworn most often by fire warrior teams, and canon describes it as a microcosm of the greater good wherein each individual sheds his individual identity in favor of his role in the group. Each participant spills their own blood with a ceremonial bonding knife. Imperial xenolexicons render the word as communion or as marriage, and neither translation is wrong. Those who have sworn it may address one another by personal name, which is a genuine and rationed intimacy in a culture where the personal name comes last and function comes first. So the supreme expression of unity in the Empire of Unity is a blood ritual in which you formally dissolve yourself into your team, and the reward for dissolving yourself is that 4 other people are permitted to know who you are. And then the restriction, which for a video asking whether the greater good is sincere may be the single sharpest fact available. Kroot may not be bonded, Vespid may not be bonded, the other member species may not be bonded. The Empire's highest ritual expression of shared identity is closed to everyone who is not Tar. Now the castes, and I want to take them one at a time, because the aggregate version of this always flattens into a diagram and the diagram hides the lives. First, the physiology they share: humanoid, hoofed feet, 4 digits on the hand, grey-blue leathery skin, flat wide faces with a vertical facial slit, vision extending into ultraviolet and infrared, which sounds like an advantage until you learn that their pupils do not dilate, which costs them depth perception and makes them slow to focus in low light. Their olfactory organs are inside the mouth. Homeworld gravity is slightly weaker than Terra's, so even the largest Tio are roughly human-sized and slightly weaker than a baseline human being. The most technologically advanced infantry in the galaxy is, unarmored, physically weaker than the men it fights. Each caste is named for an element, chosen to symbolize the purpose and temperament of its members, and each is described as effectively a subspecies. That began as genuine environmental adaptation over a very long time. It has since been locked in place, because interbreeding between castes is forbidden by the Ethereals. There is a rank ladder, a suffix appended to the caste prefix, running from Sal at the bottom through La, Ui, Vri, El and finally O at the top. And canon is explicit about how those two systems relate. The rank of a person in Tau society is second only to the caste they are born into. Rank is second, caste is first. Your entire achieved life is the junior variable. The FIO are the earth caste. Labor, agriculture, industry, science, engineering, medicine. They are stouter and shorter than the others, with calloused hands, described as plain and dour, their speech very literal and matter-of-fact. They are by far the largest caste by numbers, and they are the descendants of the besieged of Phaeton, the people inside the walls. They built the battlesuits. They built the railguns and the gravtech and the drone networks, and they built the devices the Ethereals asked them for, including one particular headset we will come to, which they assembled to specification without retaining any understanding of how it works. The Shahs are the fire caste, the ground military, the tallest and most muscular of the Tor. Canon explains that build with a phrase that ought to stop you. Generations of breeding having weeded out infirmity. The Lexicanum puts it more bluntly still. Weak strains are quickly weeded out. And then there is the darkest passage in the entire cast file, and it is not from a novel, it is from a Games Workshop source, and it is about the Empire's treatment of its own children. Their training regimen begins moments after their birth, for the great Tau communes are fully given over to raising the best soldiers and nothing else. Moments after their birth. Teams are raised together from the first day of life, which is precisely why the Talisera means what it means to them. At the end of that upbringing there is a final rite, and to pass it is to be named a warrior, and the canonical description of the children who do not pass is 1 sentence long. Those not healthy or bright enough to pass these tests are never heard from again. I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the place where a script starts inventing. Canon does not say they are killed. Canon says they are never heard from again, and then canon stops, and it has never gone back to finish the sentence. Never heard from again is what the source says, and never heard from again is what I am going to leave you with. For those who do pass, the ladder is measured out in war. The first trial by fire comes after 4 Terran years of active combat duty, and another comes every 4 years after that. Battlesuit training requires the rank of veteran at minimum, and the exit is not really an exit. Only commanders are allowed to retire from active service. Other than death, this is the only way to leave the Tau military. A fire caste Tau either climbs the entire ladder to commander, or he serves until something kills him. There is no discharge, no time served, no going home. Loyalty within the caste is enforced by an organization called the Edification Corps, and its object is worth noting precisely. Canon describes it as an organization of the caste which enforces fire caste loyalty to the Ethereals, not to the Empire, not to the Tauba, to the Ethereals as persons, and the Tau language contains a direct loanword for the Imperial version of that job, commissar, from commissar. They met the concept, they recognized it, and they kept the word. Their doctrine is built from 2 hunting techniques, the Mont'au, the killing blow, and the Kauyon, the patient hunter, and their command structure has one feature that tells you where sovereignty really sits. Teams form cadres, cadres form contingents, contingents form communes and commands and coalitions, and canon states that an ethereal might be present at cadre level, but there is always at least one when a contingent is formed. Above a certain size, a Tau military formation cannot legally exist without a priest attached to it. The poor are the water caste, diplomats, merchants, administrators, propagandists, and the people responsible for integrating alien species. They are taller and more slender, their features softer and more expressive, and they habitually adopt the mannerisms of whatever species they are dealing with. Their equipment includes a device called the polyglot headrun, a sub-vocalization translator that makes the envoy appear to be speaking fluently in the target's own dialect. Not a translator you can see. A translator that hides itself, so the alien in front of you seems to have learned your language out of respect. 3 of their functions get missed constantly. They run espionage, and many water caste emissaries are secretly members of Tau Intelligence, an organization called Information Awareness, in a unit nicknamed the 100 Eyes. The ambassador and the spy are frequently the same individual. They run the news, through organs called the Pordui, and they run internal security. That last one deserves its own beat, because it is where the friendly caste stops being friendly. The Cartier are the Empire's criminal investigators, and the name translates as Hunters of Justice. They are empowered by the Ethereal caste with broad powers of investigation. They can commandeer fire warriors, meaning the diplomatic caste can requisition soldiers, and they hold the legal right to detain any citizen of the Tau Empire for questioning. Any citizen, no qualifier. The re-education facilities are also water caste operations, which we will come back to in detail later, and here is the Imperium's own assessment of which caste is the real threat. Not the fire caste, not the air caste, the water caste, because their skill in subterfuge, diplomacy and propaganda has cost the Imperium more worlds and manpower than the fire and air caste's military prowess combined. The Imperium of Man, which solves problems with ordnance, has looked at the Tau Empire and concluded that the dangerous ones are the talkers. The core are the air caste, and they are the most physiologically diverged of all of them. Long slender limbs, hollow bones, superior depth perception where the other castes are weak, high tolerance for acceleration, and skeletons atrophied to the point where injury and broken bones are commonplace when they spend time in a gravity well. They live almost entirely off-world, and canon notes an air caste reluctance, if not outright refusal, to land on planets. Among their own species they are known as the Invisible Caste, and they carry a detail that I think is the most quietly devastating single fact in the Tau material. During the Mont'au, the mountain Tau had membranous patagia. They glided on the thermals coming off the peaks. They flew. They still possess vestigial remains of those membranes, not the wings, the remains of the wings. Somewhere in the 6,000 years between the plateau and the fleet, the caste of the air stopped being able to fly, and was issued starships instead. There is a version of that story where it is a straightforward triumph of engineering over biology. There is another version where an entire people gave up the thing they were and were handed a machine that does it better, and the folded useless tissue under the flight suit is a receipt. Canon does not tell you which version to prefer. I know which one I think about. There is one doctrinal nuance about them worth marking now, because it will matter enormously later. Air caste pilots stoically accept their casualties as sacrifices to the greater good, but canon immediately qualifies it. The Tol do not believe in senseless martyrdom. Their air groups never commit without a coherent plan and clear target, and they quickly pull out if it becomes apparent that no amount of determination and technology is going to win the day, and then the clause that does the real work. Such judgments are left up to the pilots themselves. The pilots decide when the mission is unwinnable, and they are permitted to leave. Remember that sentence. When we reach the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard in a later movement, I am going to read you that sentence again. And then the Aun'Va, the Ethereal caste. Royalty and priesthood fused into a single institution, described as mystics and philosophers, possessed of knowledge and wisdom not shared by their more practical subjects, and marked physically by a diamond-shaped ridge of raised bone in the center of the forehead. They use the same rank ladder as everyone else. The lowest form settlement councils, the highest rule entire sept worlds. Above all of them sits the Ethereal High Council on Mont'au itself, from which orders and edicts are issued and are followed without question by all across the Mont'au Empire. There is a disputed point here I am obliged to flag rather than resolve. One passage says that council is headed by a presiding officer holding the rank of Ethereal Supreme. Another says flatly that no single individual heads this council, and that it tends to be guided by the wisdom of whichever Ethereal is regarded by their peers as preeminent at the time. Those two statements cannot both be true as written. The second is the more detailed and the more recent, and describes something closer to first among equals, so that is the version I will use, while telling you plainly that the other one is also in print. Succession, though, is personal. Aun'Va chose Aun'Va by name before undertaking a ceremony called the Last Walk, in which an ancient ethereal disappears forever within one of their mysterious temple domes. Canon has never said what is inside the domes. That is the second blank, and I am leaving it as a blank too. They do consult. For weighty decisions, a wise ethereal will take counsel from the senior members of each caste, and then the qualifier that empties the courtesy of its content, although ultimate sovereignty falls upon them, and them alone. Consultative in practice, absolute in principle. Every time. Even their bodyguards are a statement. Ethereal honor guards are veteran fire warriors who forego the normal progression to battlesuit pilot and commander. To stand next to a priest, you permanently surrender your own career. It is voluntary, and it is a permanent sealing accepted as a devotion. They also live markedly longer than everyone else, and Games Workshop states it directly, that for some reason ethereals live far longer than their comrades. The official explanation is that the Toad pour their medical research into ensuring that these gifted individuals deliver their peerless guidance for as long as possible. Read that in plain language. In a short-lived species, the priesthood receives preferential life extension medicine, and the justification for the priesthood receiving it is the value of the priesthood. Which brings us to the fact that matters more than any other fact about Toad society, and it is one of the few questions in this entire subject where canon does not hedge at all. There is no caste mobility, none. A Toad's caste is determined at birth and inherited from one's parents, and for a Toad to choose another caste for himself seems to be impossible, and held contrary to the notions of the greater good. 3 separate mechanisms hold that door shut. Assignment is by birth and heredity alone. There is no aptitude test, no selection, no examination, no talent scouting. You are what your parents were. Compare that for a moment to the Imperium, where a hive scum conscript's child can in principle be taken and made into a space marine, and where an illiterate feral worlder can end up commanding a chapter. The Imperium's ladder is soaked in blood and mostly a lie, but it exists on paper. The Tor ladder does not exist at all. Interbreeding between castes is forbidden, so the biological divergence can never close. Canon calls interbreeding between castes, and with Xenos, one of the most severe crimes in the Empire, and crossing functions is criminalized. Overstepping one's lot in their caste and undertaking actions relegated to another is one of the most grievous crimes in Tau society. The example canon supplies is remarkable. An earth caste engineer is usually forbidden from using fire caste-issued weapons in a pitched battle without special permission from the Ethereals, and violation of this law commonly results in the accused being sent to a re-education facility. That is from Elemental Council, written by Noah Van Wen and published in 2024, so work it through. An earth caste engineer, in a workshop, under attack, picking up a rifle to defend his own life, has committed one of the most grievous crimes in Tau society, and the sanction is a water caste re-education facility. The only legal route across that line is express dispensation from a priest. The castes do not even live together. They reside on their own segregated worlds and in their own segregated districts. Say it plainly, because everything else about the Tau bends around it. There is no mobility between castes in the Tau Empire, only within them. You are born into your caste, you rise or fail inside its narrow ladder, and you die in it. And now the question at the center of all of it, which I am going to open and deliberately not close, because canon has refused to close it for 25 years, and I am not going to pretend to know better than the people who own the setting. Why does anyone obey the Ethereals? The canonical statement of how far that obedience goes is repeated near verbatim across editions, and it is not a metaphor. The authority of an Ethereal over the members of the other castes is so absolute that if one were to order a lower caste Tur to kill himself, that order would be met with instant and unquestioning obedience, and on the cause of it, canon says this. The method by which the Ethereals maintain control over their species is unknown to the Imperium, and possibly even to those they rule, That clause is, I think, the most important sentence in the entire Tur corpus. It is Games Workshop, in their own text, explicitly raising the possibility that the Tur themselves do not know why they obey, and then declining to say whether that is the case. Canon adds only that the Tur themselves do not question the source of these powers, accepting the greatness of their leaders on faith. There are 8 explanations in circulation, and they are not equally supported, so let me sort them. Pheromonal control through the forehead organ is the leading theory. Innate psychic ability, unseen technology, prenatal indoctrination, mass hypnosis, and invisible organic nanites, both of which Warhammer community flagged in 2022 as belonging to some outliers among Imperial biologians, which is a polite way of saying fringe. Then pure charisma and genuine conviction, which is the Tar's own account. And finally the deified being explanation, which is not a theory about the Ethereals at all but a documented propaganda operation, because primitive species believe the Ethereals are gods and, in canon's words, naturally, the Ethereals themselves help propagate and encourage this particular myth. The psychic theory can be dismissed almost immediately, and it is telling that the Imperium keeps reaching for it anyway. The Tar have virtually no warp presence and can never develop psychic powers. A psychic ethereal caste would be a species-level contradiction. It is not the strongest theory. It is the weakest one, and it survives because psychers are the only explanation the Imperium has practice at, which leaves the pheromone theory, and this is where I need you to actually listen, because what everybody repeats about this is not what the source says. The primary document is the dissection of a female ethereal by Magos biologist Charles Darvis, recorded in Xenology. Here is what it found. Ridged carapace contains ultra-dense chemohormonal fluids with an overpowering scent. Rear ganglia connects to the cerebral lobe. Polyp structures vaguely reminiscent of pheromone glands found amongst Terran invertebrates, and the comparison offered is the silkworm. Then a parenthetical speculation, perhaps a pheromonal communication system, and then the conclusion. Results are inconclusive, and the purpose of this organ remains unknown. Every substantive clause in that document is hedged. Vaguely reminiscent, perhaps. Speculation. The single document that the entire internet cites as proof of pheromonal mind control explicitly declines to prove it, in its own final line, and the people quoting it have simply stopped reading one sentence early. And there is a later passage that is far more decisive and almost never quoted at all. There is an ethereal named Aun'Va Malaviara, low-ranking, who was captured alive by a Death Watch kill team and is still held by the Ordo Xenos, alive, in a cell, and here is the finding. It was assumed that this organ must be key to the control effect, yet the specimen captured has been extensively examined and no functioning biological system has been identified. Either the captured Ethereal is a deliberate attempt to misdirect the Imperium, or the matter is far more esoteric than had previously been thought. The Imperium has dissected a dead Ethereal and found an inconclusive result. It has a living one in captivity and has found no functioning system at all. Note also that a smaller version of the forehead organ exists in every other caste. It is not unique to the Ethereals, it is only larger in them. And the explanation nobody takes seriously is the one the Mont'au actually offer, which is that it is genuine, a species traumatized to the edge of extinction, saved inside a single year by a caste that arrived from nowhere, and then led through 6,000 years of unbroken ascent from nomadism to starflight, might revere that caste absolutely for entirely ordinary reasons that require no mind control whatsoever. Canon has never ruled that out. Games Workshop's own official article lists it first, completely straight-faced. I should tell you where the sinister reading came from, because it has a documented publication history and it is a genuine retcon. The original Codex Tau, 3rd edition, published in 2001, presented the Mont'au as a broadly optimistic young empire. Then, in the wiki's own words, this concept was introduced after fans complained that the initial Mont'au codex described the Mont'au in too much of a positive light, and that they were too good for the grim, dark Warhammer 40,000 universe. The darker material, the pheromone hints, the Orwellian Vespid helms, the possibly even to those they rule ambiguity, was layered on from Codex Tau Empire, 4th edition, 2006 onward. It was a deliberate darkening applied in response to audience reception, not an original design. And in the 25 years since, Games Workshop has kept it permanently unproven, on purpose. Their own official article on the question says that no one knows how natural this is, and then footnotes that sentence. The footnote reads, "The Ethereals do, but they ain't telling. That is the company that owns the answer, telling you in a joke that they have one and will not give it to you. Any video that asserts a single explanation is inventing. This one is going to leave the question standing, and it is going to stay standing all the way to the end. One last piece before the Thor are on the table, and it is the piece that reframes everything you think you know about their rationalism. Codex Thor Empire, 10th edition, 2024, states that the Thor have no visible psyches whatsoever. Their souls are meager compared to humans, barely registering in the warp at all, appearing to witch sight as a shifting will-o'-the-wisp rather than the burning fire that represents a human's soul. Get the formulation right, because it is routinely botched. Imperial observers describe a reduced mind spore, not absent like a blank's, not comparable to a human's, muted, and only tenuously anchored to the materium. The Thor are not blanks, and they are not soulless, they are dim. Never call them pariahs, and crucially, they are not immune. The demonstration is on the record. Fire warriors of Viorla Sept, facing a World Eater's incursion, suffered rage, irrational behavior, and mental degradation from proximity to chaos alone, and millions died before the ethereal caste restored order. Millions. Dim is not safe. Dim is just quiet. The practical costs are enormous. No navigators, so their ships cannot traverse the deep warp and are limited to shallow dives that are vastly slower. No astropaths, so an interstellar empire is dependent on physical messenger ships to carry its own mail. Canon states plainly that these two deficits have greatly slowed Mont'au expansion. Their word for the immaterium is Varshonan, and most of what they know about it is salvaged from other species' technology. Now put those two facts side by side. A civilization almost blind to the warp built a rational, materialist, technocratic, secular progressive ideology in a galaxy where the warp is the fundamental substrate of reality. The dossier this video is built on calls that the disability mistaken for enlightenment, and I think that is exactly right. Mont'au rationalism is not a philosophical achievement arrived at by clear thinking. It is what a worldview looks like when it is assembled by people who cannot perceive the largest thing in the universe. They are not more clear-eyed than the Imperium. They are missing a sense, and they have built a civilization on the assumption that what they cannot detect is not there. And their solution to their own blindness tells you what kind of empire they are. They annexed the Nikasar, a species of powerful psychers, hid them from humanity so that imperial witch hatred would not be aroused, and used their minds to move ships. They outsourced the sense they lack to a client species, kept that species out of sight, and produced no theology and no defense of their own, which is how a fleet of materialists, decades later and light years from home, found itself being saved from diamonds by something that appeared to be a god made out of their own slogan. Now turn around, face the other way across the Damocles Gulf, and look at the thing the toe have been offered a place inside of. The Imperium of Man is most commonly described as 1,000,000 worlds. The population figures run from 4 quadrillion at the most conservative estimate to 40 quadrillion at the loosest, and the reason the range is that wide is that nobody has ever counted. It is the largest human polity in the setting's history, and it is governed by a corpse in a chair. And almost everything you think you know about what it believes is the exact opposite of what it was founded to believe. Because the Imperium did not begin as a religion, it began as an argument against religion. The founding ideology of the Imperium was called the Imperial Truth, and canon describes it as the atheistic, rationalist and materialist ideology promulgated by the Emperor of Mankind across all the worlds of the Imperium during the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. Its stated values were reason, respect for the methodology of science, and secular progress. Its central claim was that the universe was rational, that knowledge defeated fear, and that knowledge brought freedom from the terrors of old night. That is not a slogan invented by a fan. That is the doctrine, in the record, in the Emperor's own words as the setting preserves them. Understand what that meant in practice. Humanity emerging from the age of strife was a species that had spent thousands of years in the dark, and in the dark it had built gods out of everything that frightened it. Every reconquered world came with its own priesthood, its own idols, its own explanations for the horrors in the void. The Emperor's position was that all of it had to go, not the dangerous parts, all of it. He banned any religious practices regardless of whether or not they were more or less obviously connected to chaos. There was no category of harmless faith. There was faith, and there was the correction of faith, and he did not enforce that with soldiers alone. He built a professional caste to do it. They were called iterators, and their job was rhetoric, trained state persuaders who traveled ahead of the fleets and spoke to newly compliant populations. Canon says they paid particular attention to the eradication of any religious or superstitious beliefs among the populace, replacing them with calm, cool rationalism and a strong, almost Victorian belief in scientific progress. Read that description again and notice what it is. A dedicated diplomatic and ideological caste, sent in advance of the war fleet, whose function is to replace what a population believes with what the state requires it to believe. If that arrangement sounds familiar, it should. The Emperor of Mankind invented the water caste 10,000 years before the Tau got around to it, and there is a rot at the bottom of it, which I think is the single most useful fact in the entire imperial file. The Imperial Truth taught that the universe was rational and that supernatural entities did not exist. The Emperor knew that was false. He knew about the warp. He knew about chaos. He knew the names and the appetites of the ruinous powers better than any living human, and he suppressed all knowledge of them deliberately, on the reasoning that gods starve without worshippers, and a humanity that did not believe in the chaos gods would be a humanity that fed them nothing. So the galaxy's great rationalist project was itself a lie, a calculated, strategic, load-bearing lie, told by a leader who knew better, to a species he judged incapable of handling the truth. The Imperium's founding document was a piece of managed information. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter enormously later. The clearest legal expression of all this came at the Council of Nicaea, in the first year of the 31st millennium. It was convened, in the source's own phrasing, to determine whether or not the use of psychic powers represented a boon or a grave danger. Magnus the Red argued the case for the Psychers, joined by Sanguinius and by Jagatai Khan, proposing formal librarius departments within the legions, regulated, trained, accountable psychic warriors, out in the open where they could be supervised. It was, by any reasonable standard, the sensible compromise. The Emperor rejected it. He commanded the Primarchs to close their librarius departments forthwith. The resulting decree absolute permitted a narrow band of sanctioned psychers, navigators and astropaths, the two the Imperium physically could not run without, under what canon calls tightly restricted, centralized imperial control, and it banned sorcery outright, meaning any bargaining with entities in the warp. The irony there is layered thick enough to chew. The most powerful psyker in human history banned psychic practice. And the primary casualty of that ban, Magnus, who had argued for regulation and openness, continued his work in secret because he had been left no legitimate way to continue it at all, and that secrecy is the direct road that ends with the 1,000 Suns kneeling to Tsiench. The ban produced the thing it was written to prevent. That is going to become a pattern, which brings us to the inversion, and to the best piece of irony in this entire setting. There was a book called the Lectitia Divinitatis. Canon describes it as a religious book penned by the Primarch Lorgar of the Word-Bearers before his fall to chaos, and its thesis was simple, that the Emperor of mankind was a divine being, the one true God of humanity. Lorgar did not write it to undermine his father. He wrote it because he genuinely believed it, and because he was constitutionally incapable of understanding a universe that did not have something to worship at the center of it. His legion's compliances were slower than everyone else's, because they did not merely conquer worlds, they converted them, and they built cathedrals, and they taught the populations to pray, and the crown of that work was a city called Monarchia, a world brought to compliance and then rebuilt as a monument, a model of Lorgar's religious devotion, a city constructed entirely to honor the Emperor as a god. The Emperor's response is the fact I would put at the center of any honest account of imperial ideology. He reprimanded Lorgar, and he ordered the Ultramarines to destroy the city of Monarchia, to serve as a lesson against deification, not to correct it, not to repurpose it, to take a fully compliant, fully loyal, entirely obedient human city and reduce it to ash as a demonstration, and then to make the Primarch who built it kneel in the ruins. Sit with the shape of that for a second. A man ordered the annihilation of a city for the crime of calling him divine. Whatever else you say about the Emperor's project, he was not ambiguous about this one thing. He did not want to be a god. He considered the belief that he was a god to be the specific, named, most dangerous error a human being could make, and he was prepared to spend a city to say so out loud. 10,000 years later, he is a god. He is worshipped by 4 quadrillion people. There is an entire arm of the state whose sole function is to enforce his worship, and the penalty for denying his divinity is death. And I want to be precise about how that happened, because the mechanism is more damning than the outcome. The suppression of the Lectitia Divinitatis did not kill the faith, it drove it underground, where it spread through the expeditionary fleets as an underground text, and it humiliated Lorgar so completely that when Chaos offered him a set of gods who would actually accept his devotion, he took it. Lorgar's fall is a direct consequence of Monarchia. The Word-Bearer's fall is the seed of the Horus Heresy, and the Horus Heresy is what put the Emperor on the Golden Throne as a dying thing that could no longer contradict anybody about anything. So the Emperor's suppression of his own worship is a direct cause of the war that made his worship inevitable. He raised a city to prevent a religion, and the raising is what built the religion. I do not think there is a cleaner tragic mechanism anywhere in this fiction. The cult had its saints before the heresy even finished. Euphrati Keeler was a remembrancer attached to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, an imagist, a civilian, a documentary photographer brought along to record the Great Crusade for posterity. She survived things she should not have survived. She began to be venerated as a living saint and prophet of the Emperor, and she became the cult's first martyr figure. Note where she came from, not a conquered world clinging to its old gods, from inside the fleet, from inside the machinery of the rationalist project itself, staffed by the state, sailing under the Emperor's own standard. The faith was not a foreign infection, it grew in the Imperium's own tissue. After the heresy, with the Emperor interred in the Golden Throne and unable to issue a single correction, belief in his divinity became more widespread, and the Lectitia Divinitatis evolved into the imperial cult. Belief in the imperial truth, in Canon's own words, slowly eroded, year by year, world by world, until the Adeptus Ministorum was officially established in the 32nd millennium, and the imperial cult was recognized as the state religion by the High Lords of Terra. The whole arc fits in one sentence. A man who banned religion was made a god by the state he built to prevent it, and the instrument of his deification was a book he ordered burned. So what does that religion actually require of you? Because this is where it has to be laid out plainly, so it can be set against the greater good later. The Imperial Creed is by design adaptable. Canon calls it highly flexible, tailored by the Adeptus Ministerum's missionaries to fit the native culture, prior existing religion and cultural practices of whatever world it exists upon. A newly compliant world does not have its gods deleted. It has its gods reassigned. Your mountain spirit was always an aspect of the Emperor. Your harvest goddess was a saint. The paint changes, the frame does not, but underneath the local color there is a hard core, and deviation from it is heresy. First, that the Emperor once walked among men, but he is, and always has been, a god. Second, that the Emperor is the one true God, regardless of what past faiths any human may have worshipped. Third, to purge the heretic, beware the psyker and mutant, and abhor the alien. Fourth, that every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order. Fifth, to unquestionably obey the authority of the imperial government and one's superiors. The foundational beliefs of the cult Imperialis run alongside those: the divinity of the Emperor, his power to intercede in matters both spiritual and temporal, the power of prayer, and the divine right of mankind to rule the stars. Read the fourth tenet again on its own. Every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order. That is not a promise of dignity. It is a description of a filing system. It says that you are accounted for, that the accounting was done without you, and that stepping outside your entry in the ledger is a spiritual offense and not merely a practical one. The doctrine is delivered to the population in small, repeatable doses. They are called thoughts for the day, short catechetical slogans printed through imperial publications, described in the sources as condensed bits of the Imperial Creed about how people should hate the alien, the heretic and the mutant, shut up, toil endlessly and obey their overlords without question. An entire theology compressed into a line you can memorize before your shift starts. That is not an accident of format. That is the format doing exactly what it was designed to do to a population that mostly cannot read. Now, the ecclesiarchy. Because a state religion is not a set of beliefs, it is a balance sheet, and the ecclesiarchies is enormous. The church that grew out of the Lectitian Divinitatus was originally the temple of the Savior Emperor, recognized by the High Lords in the early 32nd millennium, and formalized as the Adeptus Ministerum. Its high priest is the ecclesiarch. A few centuries in, Ecclesiarch Veneris II received a seat on the Centitorum Imperialis, and after 300 years that seat was made permanent. The church had gone from an illegal underground text to a permanent chair at the table where the species is governed, and it got rich. Canon calls the ecclesiarchy a political, economic, and military powerhouse, with wealth drawn from tithes, donations, property holdings, and the labor of countless faithful. The orthodox doctrine was that sacrifices of wealth and money to the Adeptus Ministerum in taxes, tithes, and other gifts were necessary to enhance access to salvation. Pay the church, improve your afterlife, and the church will hold the receipt. And the consequence is stated flatly in the record. The Ministerum's tithes took precedence over the Adeptus Administratum's own raising of funds, leaving little in the coffers to pay for the running of the secular components of the Imperium. The church out-taxed the state. Read that as the constitutional fact it is. The organization devoted to worshipping the man who banned worship was collecting more revenue than the organization that keeps the lights on, and then a man noticed how much power that was, and took all of it. Vandire became the 361st master of the administratum, a position Canon says he attained by the ruthless application of bribes, threats, and outright assassination of his rivals. Having taken the top of the secular bureaucracy, he then took the ecclesiarchy as well. He held both offices at once, High Lord of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch simultaneously, the purse and the pulpit, in the same pair of hands, with no institution above either of them. What followed is called the Age of Apostasy, or, more directly, the Reign of Blood. He purged the Imperium of any dissenters with the backing of armies of millions of frenzied imperial cultists and a personal army called the Frateris Templars. Not a coup, not a season of unrest. A sustained, institutional, ideologically justified slaughter of the Imperium's own population by the Imperium's own church. He held power for almost a standard century. I want that number to land properly, because it is easy to skim past. 100 years. Long enough that a person could be born under the reign of blood, live an entire working life inside it, and die without ever having known an imperium that was not eating itself. The institution that is supposed to be the moral spine of the species produced a tyrant, and then could not remove him for 4 generations. He was finally overthrown in the midst of the Terran Crusade and slain by his own bodyguards, the daughters of the Emperor, when they learned what he was, which is to say the Imperium did not correct him. He was killed by the women he had personally armed when they found out he had lied to them, and the reforms that followed are the shape of the Imperium you know today. The Adepta Sororitas were created as the Ecclesiarchy's military arm and as the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus. The Ordo Hereticus itself was created specifically to police enemies within the Imperium's own structures, an internal affairs division for a government that had just discovered its own church could seize it, and Ecclesiarch Sebastian Thor issued the Decree Passive. The Decree Passive is the Imperium's single most significant constitutional limit on clerical power. It held that the Ecclesiarchy could maintain no men under arms. After a century of a priest-emperor's private armies butchering the faithful, the Church was legally stripped of the ability to raise troops permanently by its own reforming leader. The decree lasted approximately as long as it took somebody to read it carefully. Because the daughters of the Emperor, the women who had killed Vandire, were not men, Thor argued that the all-female order was therefore not obliged to disband under the wording of his own decree, and incorporated them into the Ministorum as the Adepta Sororitas. The Imperium's supreme legal reform against clerical militarism was defeated in the same century by the man who wrote it, using a pun, and here is the part that I think elevates it from a joke to an indictment. Canon heavily hints the wording was deliberate, that Thor chose the phrase knowing exactly what it did and did not forbid, because a church without a militant arm would be dissolved and swallowed by rivals within a few years, and he needed both things at once, a law that satisfied everyone demanding the church be disarmed, and a loophole large enough to march an army through. So the Great Reform is not a piece of clumsy drafting that got exploited. It is a piece of precise drafting that was written to be exploited by a reformer in the immediate aftermath of the worst atrocity his institution ever committed. There is a smaller detail attached to the same period that says something equally unflattering. The Confederation of Light was a theological rival of the Temple of the Savior Emperor, and it was persecuted and mostly destroyed by the first of the wars of faith called by the Ministorum. Centuries later it was reborn under Sebastian Thor in the 36th millennium as the vehicle of the reform that saved the Imperium. The Imperial Church exterminated its own capacity for reform, and then had to resurrect the corpse of it 1,000 years afterwards to survive the consequences. Now, the machinery. Because ideology in the Imperium is not principally delivered by priests, it is delivered by paperwork. The Adeptus Administratum handles the planetary tithes, the resource allocation and the population counts for 1,000,000 worlds, with what Canon calls truly stultifying levels of bureaucracy, to the point that some wayward souls believe that the Imperium survives despite, rather than because of, its efforts. That is the setting making a joke. The joke is load-bearing. Every world is assigned a tithe grade, and the ladder is real and specific. At the bottom sits aptus non, which means exempt, nothing owed. Above that, solutia prima, solutia tertius, solutia extremis. Then the decuma grades, decuma prima, decuma particular, decuma extremis. Then the exactis grades, exactis prima, exactis tertius, exactis particular, and exactis extremis, and at the top, above all of them, experima. At the upper grades the language in the record stops being administrative and starts being honest. Entire societies may be sacrificed to meet the Imperium's ever-growing demands. Worlds depleted to the point of collapse, their resources fully extracted, with populations numbering in the billions being made solely of laborers. A planet under exactis extremis, or experima, is pushed to the very edge of its productive capacity, with no regard whatsoever for long-term viability. That is a legal instrument for consuming a world, not a punishment, not a war measure, a grade on a form, filed by a clerk who will never see the place, which converts a living civilization of billions into an extraction schedule, and then keeps extracting until there is nothing to extract. The Imperium does not need to conquer you to do this. This is what it does to worlds that are loyal. Then there is the other tithe, the one paid in people. Black ships are Inquisition vessels, and their function is collection. When a black ship nears a planet, its imperial planetary governor is instructed to prepare the customary levy, a tithe of unsanctioned psychers drawn from the world's population. Note the word customary. This is routine. It is expected. Every world in the Imperium knows the ships are coming, and knows that some of its children will be aboard when they leave, and the governor is not asked, he is instructed. Where do they go? A minority are trained and sanctioned. Some undergo soul binding, in which their eyes are burned out as they join the ranks of the astropaths whose telepathic communications hold the Imperium together. That is the price of admission to the Imperium's postal service, and it is charged in eyes. 10,000 specially trained psychers sustain the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon by which every Imperial ship navigates the warp, and their life forces are exhausted in a matter of solar months, and the rest are fuel. The Emperor consumes the life energies of 1,000 psychers every solar day to sustain the beacon, 1,000 human beings a day, every day, for 10,000 years. Not as a wartime emergency, not as a dark secret uncovered by a rogue inquisitor, but as the published, understood, mechanical basis on which interstellar travel and interstellar communication both function. If the sacrifice stops, the beacon dims, the ships lose the light, and the Imperium ceases to be a single polity within about a generation. The entire species is held together by a daily human sacrifice at a rate that would empty a small city every year. And then there are the servitors, which I think is where the Imperium's ideology stops being merely brutal and becomes something stranger. Servitors are described as mindless, cybernetic drones created from a fusion of human flesh and robotic technology. They run the Imperium's machinery, its gun batteries, its cargo lifts, its cogitators, its production lines. They exist, specifically because of the strict prohibitions against the development or use of machine intelligences according to the tenets of the cult Mechanicus. The Imperium will not build a thinking machine. It considers the thinking machine an abomination, so it makes them out of people. Many servitors are vat-grown subhuman clones, and you can construct an argument about those. But others were once truly human. A criminal, particularly one who has offended the cult Mechanicus, will be sentenced to servitude in perpetuis and handed over to the tech priests to be mind-wiped, reprogrammed, and cybernetically enhanced to serve some specific, rudimentary function. That is a judicial sentence. It is passed in a court, on a person, for a crime, and the sentence is the deletion of the person and the retention of the body as equipment. The process is a lobotomy performed with intent. The record specifies that the parieto-insular cortex that processes pain through the neuromatrix is one of many segments of the brain cauterized during the servitude transmogrification process. They do not remove the capacity for pain out of mercy. They remove it because a machine that flinches is a machine that underperforms. And here is the detail that I cannot get past, and I have thought about this one a great deal. The altered and fragmented brain of a servitor functions poorly unless constantly supervised, and most will go into a state of mind lock, babbling incoherent nonsense as the servitor tries to assert some form of awareness. It tries to assert some form of awareness. Whatever was cut out was not cut out cleanly. There is something still in there, pushing at the walls of a skull it no longer controls, and the Imperium's word for that is a malfunction. The correct response, per doctrine, is to have a tech priest reset it. An empire that refuses artificial intelligence on religious grounds manufactures obedient thinking machines out of living human beings, having first destroyed the mind inside, and then classifies the residue of that mind as a maintenance issue. Against all of that, what is life actually like for a person in this state? The sources do not soften it. Life for an average human within the Imperium of Man is a bleak and often perilous existence, characterized by hardship, fear and devotion. Most individuals are born into a society governed by strict regimentation, where loyalty to the God Emperor is paramount and dissent is swiftly punished. Most of them live in hives. Each hive houses millions, even billions, stacked in a single continent-scaled structure built on an obvious class system, with ruling nobles at the top, a bureaucratic middle class beneath them, and a working class packed together in the lower areas. And the line the sources give about those lower levels is the one I would put on the screen if I could only choose one. Many hive citizens live their entire lives without seeing natural sunlight, breathing unfiltered air, or knowing that a sky exists. not without seeing the sky, without knowing that a sky exists. Born, worked and buried inside a machine, in a species that rules a million worlds among the stars, and never once informed that there are stars. Below the working levels is the underhive, where there is no law save for that created by the gangs, where the power was long ago turned off and only might makes right. Below that, radioactive waste zones, uninhabitable for most life forms except monstrous mutants, who are of course people, and who are down there because of what is done to them further up. As for how long any of this lasts, the specific figures the community cites are not firmly sourced, so treat them loosely, factory workers into their 30s or 40s, because occupational health and safety is not really a concern, agri-world laborers and mid-level administratum scribes reaching perhaps 50 to 80. Many are outright worked to death, and that phrase is not rhetorical flourish, it is a description of the recorded cause, and most of them never learn what any of it is for. The ordinary imperial citizen does not know about chaos, does not know the true nature of the warp, has no idea that the Emperor's original doctrine was the precise opposite of the faith they were raised in, and in most cases has never heard that the Tau exist at all. Now the piece of evidence I consider the most important in this entire video, because it is not interpretation, and it is not a fan reading, it is the Imperium documenting its own decline in its own administrative record. Mutants first. Policy varies by world and the variation itself is telling. On primitive worlds mutants are often slain at birth, while on more advanced worlds they may be allowed to live, but are usually segregated from the normal population and rarely enjoy the benefits of other humans. Some cannot leave their homeworld even as slaves. They form a huge downtrodden portion of the Imperium's population, huge meaning that we are discussing a persecuted underclass numbering in the many billions, and in the same breath, the Adeptus Mechanicus trades with mutant clans in the underhive for Archaeotech. Official doctrine says purge. Official practice says purchase. Above the mutants sit the abhumans, defined as stable, genetically divergent subspecies officially recognized by the Adeptus Terra as sanctioned mutants utilized for their unique traits. Roughly 15 breeds remain active, of which 12 are named: Navigators, Beastmen, Ogryn, Ratlings, Squats, Nightsiders, Troths, Longshanks, Pelagers, Felinids, Scalies and Neandors. Sanctioned. Not citizens, sanctioned, the way a weapon is sanctioned, useful under license. And then the trajectory, quoted as canon gives it. In more enlightened times under the direct rule of the Emperor during the Great Crusade, even markedly divergent abhumans such as the Beastmen could serve in the Imperial army. However, since the Emperor's stasis on the Golden Throne began, only the lesser abhuman mutants, such as Ogryns and Ratlings, are allowed full citizenship, and of the rest, many strains were later reclassified as mutants and purged. Take that apart slowly, because every clause is doing work. In more enlightened times, that is the Imperium's own record grading its own past as more enlightened than its present. Beastmen, one of the most visibly divergent strains in the setting, carried imperial weapons in imperial formations under the Emperor's personal command. 10,000 years later they are Xenos-adjacent vermin to be shot on sight. Nobody changed. Their genetics did not drift. The category changed. A population that was legally human was administratively reclassified as not human, and then the machinery that processes not humans was pointed at them and switched on. That is the Imperium's tolerance shrinking, measurably, in a documented direction, over a documented span of time. It is not that the Imperium is cruel, plenty of states are cruel, it is that the Imperium is getting worse, and it wrote down that it is getting worse, and the mechanism by which it gets worse is a clerk narrowing a definition. There is no war that caused this, there is no invasion. The category of acceptable humans simply contracts, century by century, and everyone who falls outside the new border is killed by a bureaucracy that considers the matter closed. Whatever else the Imperium is doing, it is not holding a line. It is retreating along one, and the retreat is written in its own filing. The same instinct, pointed outward, produces the Xenos policy. A fundamental tenet of the Emperor's rise to power was the superiority of humans to all things alien. He announced that humanity had a preordained destiny to rule the stars, and he was the one to pen the phrase "suffer not the alien to live." giving orders for the extermination of all sapient xenos who could possibly threaten or influence humanity. And note the word suffer, in its archaic sense, not endure, but permit. Do not permit the alien to live. It is not an expression of pain, it is an instruction about tolerance. I do want to be fair to this before I take it apart, because the reasoning is not irrational, and it would be dishonest to present it as simple bigotry. Humanity's collective memory in the 41st millennium is one of betrayal and slaughter at the hands of alien races. The war in heaven, the fall of the Eldari that tore open the Eye of Terror, the Xenos betrayals through the Age of Strife, those are real events in this fiction, and they happen to real human populations, and every one of them is a reason. The Imperium's xenophobia is a trauma response to a history that actually occurred. The problem is what a trauma response becomes when you institutionalize it, hand it a fleet, and run it for 10,000 years without review. From a young age, citizens of the Imperium are taught to fear and hate the Xenos, not to be cautious, to hate as a curriculum subject before they are old enough to ask why. Enforcing all of it is the Inquisition, and the Inquisition structure tells you what the Imperium is actually afraid of. 3 major ordos: the Ordo Malleus, which hunts daemons, the Ordo Hereticus, which hunts heresy, mutation and apostasy inside the Imperium's own structures, and the Ordo Xenos, which handles aliens. Its agents answer to nobody, may depose planetary governors, may commandeer fleets, and may destroy any imperial institution they judge compromised. Internally it is split. The Puritans hold that the status quo must be upheld, and that dabbling with the forces of chaos and Xenos technology is heresy in all forms, among them the monodominants, who believe that the Imperium, and only the Imperium, should be allowed to exist, which is the shortest complete statement of imperial ideology anyone has ever written down. The radicals hold that battling the enemy justifies all means, even using its own weapons, among them the Xanthites, who advocate daemon hosts, daemon weapons and chaos sorcery, and whose ultimate goal is to harness the power of chaos for mankind, believing it cannot be defeated as it is merely a reflection of humanity itself. And where an inquisitor decides a world is beyond saving, there is exterminatus. The doctrine is the total destruction of all life on a world, invoked when a planet is judged beyond salvation and its continued existence a greater danger than its loss. The modern standard method is cyclonic torpedoes, producing the complete destruction of all life on the planet, its atmosphere burned away in a storm of fire, and its oceans boiled to vapor, leaving it a barren rock. The older method was the virus bomb, and the life-eater virus, genetically designed to quickly spread and destroy all organic cellular structures it infects, reducing all planetary life, whether flora or fauna, to an undifferentiated organic sludge, and capable of spreading across the entire surface of a planet in a matter of minutes, a biosphere that took 4 billion years to assemble, converted to slurry between one meal and the next. It is used, Istvan III, by Horus, at the outbreak of the heresy. Stalin Vast, in 273.M41, virus bombed following a gene-stealer infestation, though I should flag that the sources conflict over which novel documents that, so treat the literary citation as unverified even though the event is canon. Malby, in 936.M41, by Marnius Calgar, who first permitted the two to evacuate the world, and then destroyed it. And Agrellan, at the very end of the 41st millennium, which we will come back to. What Exterminatus encodes is a specific proposition about worth, that the risk of a world is calculable, that the lives on it are a quantity on one side of that calculation, and that a sufficiently large number in the risk column authorizes setting the other side to 0. Every population under imperial rule lives inside that arithmetic, whether or not they have ever heard of it, which leaves the last question, what the Imperium does to the people who fight for it, and the answer is that it treats them as consumables, and says so in writing. Guardsmen are expendable, and often used to ensure the real work gets done. Their losses are often not missed, and are easily replaced by recruiting from their homeworlds, and the exchange rate is stated outright. The loss of 100 Imperial Guardsmen would not equal the loss of 1 Space Marine. That is not a soldier's bitter joke. That is doctrine, and it is how the tasking is actually done. Some of them did not volunteer in any sense you would recognize. Prisoners from certain worlds are offered a chance off their prison planet in exchange for almost certain death fighting in the worst battlefields imaginable. That is the offer, near certain death, in exchange for dying somewhere other than where you are. And holding all of it in place is the commissariat. A commissar is a political officer attached to a regiment, responsible for its morale, its ideological purity and its obedience, and the sources describe the job without any softening at all. In extremis, a commissar must be prepared to execute wavering soldiers or incompetent officers without a moment's remorse. Few things enforce discipline better than a malcontent or coward being shot dead for their failings, and this message is all the stronger when a mass-reactive bolt sprays a guardsman's brains across their horrified comrades in a shower of gore. Read what that passage is actually arguing. It is not describing an unfortunate necessity, it is making a case for the aesthetics of the execution, the specific advantage of the bolt round over a cleaner weapon because of what the mess does to the men watching. The gore is the point, the gore is the instrument. Someone in the Imperium worked out that the horror on the faces of the survivors was the operative part of the discipline and wrote it into the standing guidance. A commissar's authority runs upward as well. He may override or execute a regiment's commanding officer, which means the man with the tactical training can be shot by the man with the ideological training for reaching a conclusion the ideology dislikes, and the core is regarded, in canon's phrasing, with a mixture of fear, loathing and admiration, all three, from the same men, which is precisely what a functioning terror apparatus feels like from the inside. So that is the Imperium, an atheist state that became a theocracy, ruled in the name of a man who destroyed a city to deny his own divinity, funded by a church that outtaxes the government, administered by a bureaucracy that can legally consume a planet, navigating by the daily consumption of 1,000 human souls, staffed at the machine level by lobotomized convicts, and disciplined by officers whose written guidance specifies the correct weapon for maximum spatter, and it is still, on its own record, narrowing. In the last year of the 41st millennium, the strains of humanity permitted to bear arms alongside the Emperor's own soldiers number fewer than they did on the day he wrote the order that founded it. So now we put them side by side, and we do it honestly, one pair at a time. Start with the thing both empires promise and neither delivers, which is a place for you. A Tau is born into a caste, and that caste is inherited from the parents, and there is no test, no aptitude examination, no selection board. Canon is unusually blunt about what happens next, and I want the exact wording rather than a paraphrase. For a Tau to choose another caste for himself seems to be impossible, and is held contrary to the notions of the greater good. Not difficult, not discouraged, impossible, and heretical besides. Interbreeding between castes is forbidden by the Ethereals, which means the physical differences between an Earth caste laborer and an air caste pilot are not shrinking over the generations, they are widening by policy. The air caste's bones are hollow now. Their skeletons have atrophied to the point where broken bones are commonplace whenever they spend time in a gravity well. That is not a job description, that is speciation, administered from above, and it is happening on purpose. The Imperium works the other way around and arrives somewhere that looks similar from a distance. An Imperial citizen is also assigned a place at birth, by planet of origin, by hive level, by family trade, with no test and no selection either. A hive world is built on an obvious class system, ruling nobles at the top, a bureaucratic middle, and a working class packed into the lower levels, and canon states plainly that many hive citizens live their entire lives without seeing natural sunlight, without breathing unfiltered air, without knowing that a sky exists. Below them is the underhive, where there is no law except what the gangs make, where the power was turned off generations ago, and might makes right. Below that are radioactive waste zones uninhabitable to anything but mutants. Nobody in that structure signed anything, nobody chose it, and yet the honest answer to which is worse is not the one I expected when I started reading. Here is my reasoning, and you can weigh it yourself. The Tau barrier is biological, legal, criminal and total. Crossing it counts among the most grievous crimes in the Empire, and the punishment is a re-education facility. The castes are not even permitted to cohabit. They reside on their own segregated planets. The imperial barrier is none of those things. It is practical rather than legal, and it is porous in ways the Tau system is not. There are genuine vertical escape hatches, and they are real and canonical. The Adeptus Astartes, the Inquisition, the Navis Nobilit, rogue traders. The Scholar Progenium, a child born in the filth of a hive bottom can, in principle and occasionally in fact, become a space marine. That road is narrow, brutal, and it usually kills you. It exists. In the Tau Empire, the equivalent road does not exist at all. So on the narrow question of mobility, the Imperium wins, and I think you have to say so out loud. But look at what the Imperium buys that mobility with. The Tau assign you a job at birth. The Imperium assigns your entire planet a productivity quota, and the quota can legally consume the planet. The tithe grades are a real ladder, from aptus non at the exempt bottom, through the solucio and decuma and exactis bands, up to exactis extremis and finally experima at the top. At those top grades, entire societies may be sacrificed to meet the Imperium's ever-growing demands, depleted to the point of collapse, their resources fully extracted, with populations numbering in the billions consisting solely of laborers. Worlds are pushed to the very edge of their productive capacity, with no regard whatsoever for long-term viability. The toll fix your place. The Imperium is willing to spend your entire world down to bedrock and file the paperwork afterwards. And notice that both ideologies say the same sentence about it. The toll say every self-aware being is equal and plays an important part. The Imperial Creed says every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order. Read those twice. They are the same claim in different vocabulary, and what both of them actually mean is that your place is assigned and you will keep it. The difference is that the Tau name the castes, publish the ranks, and put the caste into your name so that every Tau who ever addresses you knows exactly what you are. The Imperium runs an unnamed, unadministered, undeclared class system, while insisting the arrangement is divine. If I had to compress the whole pair into one line, it would be this. The Tau built a cage and labeled the bars. The Imperium built a cage and told you it was the sky. Now the pair that I think carries more weight than any other in this entire comparison, and the one that changed how I read both factions. Both empires need machines that obey. Both of them arrived at a solution. Look at the two solutions next to each other. The Tau build drones. Every drone carries a processor with only basic intelligence, and canon likens that intelligence explicitly to a small animal. They need regular orders from a drone controller. They are programmed for self-preservation. Immobile drones self-destruct on capture, rather than be taken apart and reverse-engineered. Networked together, their intelligence rises far enough that they can operate independently for extended periods, which means the Earth caste has built a system whose ceiling goes up with aggregation and has quietly chosen not to look too hard at where that ceiling ends. And there is a hard taboo the Thor keep, one they have never crossed. They do not build self-replicating drones. The galaxy's most enthusiastic technophiles drew exactly one line in machine intelligence, and they drew it at reproduction. Drones are also not treated as disposable. Savior protocols cause a drone to throw itself into the path of a shot to shield a Thor. The machine dies for the soldier. The Imperium refuses artificial intelligence on doctrinal grounds. The cult Mechanicus calls it abominable intelligence, and the prohibition is absolute, and the Adeptus Mechanicus regards the Tau as damned as a species for their permissiveness on precisely this point. So the Imperium still needs machines that think just enough to work, and it cannot build them. Its workaround is the servitor, mindless cybernetic drones created from a fusion of human flesh and robotic technology, and the phrase that matters is human flesh. Many are vat-grown subhuman clones. Others were once truly human. A criminal, particularly one who has offended the cult Mechanicus, is sentenced to servitude in perpetuis and handed over to the tech priests to be mind-wiped, reprogrammed, and cybernetically enhanced to serve some specific rudimentary function. Read the process itself, because the process is where the horror actually lives. It is a lobotomy performed to a technical specification. The parieto-insular cortex, which processes pain through the neuromatrix, is one of many segments of the brain cauterized during the servitude transmogrification. They burn out the part of you that can feel pain, not as mercy, but because a servant that flinches is a defective servant. And the result does not work properly. The altered and fragmented brain of a servitor functions poorly unless constantly supervised, and most will eventually enter a state called mindlock, babbling incoherent nonsense as the servitor tries to assert some form of awareness. Something is still in there, it is still trying. It surfaces, and it cannot finish a sentence, and then it is reset and put back to work. So put the two policies in a single breath. The Tar build an artificial servant, cap its mind at the level of a small animal, forbid it from reproducing, and program the Empire's own soldiers' safety into its self-sacrifice. The Imperium refuses to build an artificial servant on religious principle, and manufactures one out of a living person instead, having first destroyed the mind inside and cauterized the nerve that would have let it scream. This is the point where I stop being able to describe the Imperium's position as a moral one. It is not that the Imperium values mind over machine, it is that it values doctrine over mind, and it found a loophole, and the loophole is a person. I want to be fair to this before I take it further, because the Tar policy is not innocent either, and the structure of it is the tell. The Tar solved artificial intelligence by capping capability at the level of usefulness and denying the subject the ability to ever become an equal. Now hold that sentence up against how they treat the gue'vesa, and against how they treat the vespid, and against the caste ladder itself. It is the same policy every time. Useful, cared for, permanently junior, and structurally incapable of rising. The Imperium's servitor is an atrocity. The Tar drone is a philosophy, and the philosophy is applied to living beings as readily as to machines. Which brings us to the third pair, which is what each empire does with a population it does not trust. The Tar answer is the re-education facility, and I want to be clear that this is not rumor and not fan extrapolation. It is a method of punishment and social control used by the Thor Empire, operated by the water caste, described as the ultimate sanction for those within the empire who go against the greater good. Offenders are deemed mentally deficient and condemned to a secure facility. Inside, they undergo software-based psychotherapy and regular propaganda sessions. The qualifying offenses are named, and they are worth naming again. Acting outside your designated caste, non-conformity, questioning the authority of the Ethereals, and the detail that will not leave me alone, from the Black Library novel Elemental Council by Noah Van Wyn, published in 2024, is what the returnees are like. They come back described as drooling dogs. Whatever happens in there, it works, and it does not entirely wear off. Licensed material adds that under rare circumstances, entire conquered populations of especially troublesome and stubborn species, humans being the example given, are sent to these facilities. This is not a wartime emergency measure, it is standing domestic policy. Now, there is a claim that always attaches itself to this one, and I am going to handle it properly rather than repeat it. You will hear that the Toe sterilize conquered human populations. That claim appears 3 times in the whole corpus. It appears in the Toe victory ending of a video game, Dark Crusade, released in 2006, in which the human population of Cronus is placed in gendered re-education camps and the birth rate collapses. It appears in a licensed role-playing rulebook, attached to Velkan's Sept, and it appears in a Black Library short set on Phaedra. It has never appeared in a codex, in any edition. The wiki that catalogues it labels it rumored. The game it comes from offers a separate ending for each of 7 factions, and they cannot all be true, and the publisher's own disclaimer flags that material as possibly not reflecting current law. So I am not going to use it as evidence, and neither should anyone else. I do not need it. The camps are in the codex. The camps are enough. Set that against the Imperial answer, which does not require careful sourcing because it is doctrine and it is signed. Exterminatus is the total destruction of all life on a world, invoked when a planet is judged beyond salvation and its continued existence a greater danger than its loss. The modern standard is the cyclonic torpedo, which produces the complete destruction of all life on the planet, its atmosphere burned away in a storm of fire, its oceans boiled to vapor, leaving a barren rock. The older instrument, retained in some arsenals, is the Life-Eater virus, genetically designed to spread and destroy all organic cellular structures it infects, reducing every living thing, flora and fauna alike, to an undifferentiated organic sludge, and capable of covering an entire planetary surface in a matter of minutes. So the comparison is this: faced with a population it cannot trust, the Thor Empire takes the population apart and rebuilds it into something that agrees. The Imperium removes the population, and if the population is large enough or inconvenient enough, it removes the planet. One empire's worst outcome is that you come back a drooling dog, or you are questioned and never seen again. The other empire's worst outcome is that you and everyone who shares your sky are sludge within minutes. The Thor system is more totalizing in its ambition because it wants your interior, and it is vastly less lethal in practice. The Imperium leaves your mind entirely alone because it has no interest in your mind, because it intends to end you. The fourth pair is smaller, and I think it is the most cinematic thing in the whole file. How does each empire keep a soldier fighting when the soldier can see the battle is lost? The Tau air caste doctrine is on the page, and it is startling. Air caste pilots stoically accept their casualties as sacrifices to the greater good, but the Tau do not believe in senseless martyrdom. Their air groups never commit without a coherent plan and a clear target, and they quickly pull out if it becomes apparent that no amount of determination and technology is going to win the day, and then the line that matters most. Such judgments are left up to the pilots themselves. The person who decides the engagement is unwinnable is the person flying it. The imperial answer is the commissariat, and the description of it in imperial sources is not apologetic in the slightest. In extremis, a commissar must be prepared to execute wavering soldiers or incompetent officers without a moment's remorse. Few things enforce discipline better than a malcontent or coward being shot dead for their failings, and this message is all the stronger when a mass-reactive bolt sprays a guardsman's brains across their horrified comrades in a shower of gore. That is the Imperium describing its own discipline system approvingly. The commissar may override a regiment's commanding officer, and may execute him, and the guard regards commissars with a mixture of fear, loathing, and admiration. Guardsmen themselves are expendable, canonically so, and their losses are often not missed because they are easily replaced by recruiting from their homeworlds. Some regiments are raised from prisoners offered a chance off their prison planet in exchange for near-certain death on the worst battlefields imaginable. In one empire, the soldier who judges the fight lost makes that call himself and withdraws. In the other, the soldier who judges the fight lost is shot in front of his friends, specifically so that the friends will keep going. I cannot think of a cleaner illustration of the difference in what each empire believes a soldier is for. Fifth pair. What happens to someone who disagrees out loud? The Tar Empire has a noun for its dissidents, which is more than most authoritarian states manage. Rokna, meaning ungiving, self-serving or rebellious Tar who resist the Tava. The word appears in Shadowbreaker by Steve Parker, published in 2019. Having a word for it means the phenomenon is expected, and the machinery for it is standing. There is the Mulkla, recorded in the 8th edition Codex Tau Empire from 2018, a ritual punishment that can only be declared by an Ethereal against a Tau who has erred in a particularly grievous fashion. Those subjected to it are rendered pariahs in their own society, and often such souls will seek to sell out their lives in hopes of regaining their status with a worthy death. Of the small handful of documented cases, one commander passed, and one is recorded as presumably perished, which gives that ritual, in the only sample canon offers us, roughly a coin flip survival rate. There is the Edification Corps, enforcing fire caste loyalty specifically to the Ethereals. There is the Cartier, water caste investigators with the legal right to detain any citizen. There is an intelligence service embedded in the diplomatic corps. And then there is the passage that I think is the single most sinister thing written about the Tau, and it is written flatly, as administrative fact. The Ethereal High Council has forbidden all travel and communications by Tau to the sector of the galactic west where Farsight's enclaves lie. Special councils, composed of Ethereals and auxiliary guards, are dispatched to question any who are rumored to have contacts or sympathies with the Farsight enclaves. Few who are questioned are seen again. Break that into its parts. The trigger is rumor, not evidence. The tribunal is Ethereals in person, not a delegated court. The outcome is that few are seen again, and canon does not tell us what happens to them, and the silence is deliberate. Meanwhile, the dissent itself is real and widespread. There is still support for Farsight across the septs, and many in the Fire Caste, especially those from Viorla, maintain the image of Oshova as a trailblazer, although none dare show such dissent openly in the presence of an Ethereal. And the Empire has been actively rewriting him out of its history, either avoiding mention of the fallen hero entirely or recasting him as a cowardly deserter. The imperial apparatus for the same problem is the Inquisition, with unlimited authority, answerable to nobody, empowered to depose planetary governors, destroy any imperial institution, and order exterminatus. Beneath it sit the Arbites, the Ecclesiarchy's heresy trials, the wars of faith, and servitude in perpetuis, which, as we have established, converts dissenters into machinery, and the direct comparator to the Farsight questioning councils exists, and it is worse by orders of magnitude. During the Achilles Crusade, Lord Commander Sibiaskor Ebengrave judged 3 imperial worlds, Argoth, Kagaran and Relus, so riddled with Tau emissaries and sympathizers that they were beyond hope. His stated doctrine, in his own words, was that the purges shall continue until their loyalty is total, and that while just one of them doubts, they are nothing but a nest of traitors. He also launched a paranoia-fueled witch hunt against anyone who so much as suggested that standing beside the Tar against the Tyranids might be the only way the Crusade would survive. The Tar question individuals on rumor. Ebengrave condemned 3 populated worlds on suspicion, and hunted people for the thought that an alliance against a galaxy-eating swarm might be worth considering. But here is the asymmetry that I did not expect the record to contain, and it is the strongest single thing anyone can say in the Tar's favor, so I want to say it precisely. The Tor Empire investigates, judges and punishes its own war criminals. Commander Brightsword ordered every human warrior killed during the Koloth Gorge massacre in the Nimbosa annexation, and the response was that the act was so far outside expected conduct that he was summoned back to Toh to answer for it. After the Fourth Sphere's atrocities, Shadowsun and the Ethereal High Council subjected Fourth Sphere commanders to the Malkla. The slaughters at Salkio and the Filial Station bloodshed are described in canon as far beyond every necessity of war, and canon states outright that they haunted Shadowsun and the High Council. Note also that the Malkla is the same sanction Farsight received for secession, xenocide, and political disobedience draw the identical punishment, which tells you exactly how that state ranks the 2 offenses, and that is damning in its own right. Now find me the imperial equivalent. Admiral Hawke performed an exterminatus on Agrellan after the evacuation was complete, burning millions of Tau and every human left behind on the surface, and he was not disciplined. Ebengrave purged 3 loyal imperial worlds, and he was not disciplined. The Imperium is not shown anywhere in the material I have been through, investigating, trying, or punishing a single one of its own commanders for an atrocity. Not once. And that is not because the Imperium lacks the institutional capacity, because it has an entire secret police that can depose governors on a whim. It is because within imperial doctrine those acts were not crimes. The Toh have a category called went too far. The Imperium, functionally, does not. To be fair in the other direction, the Imperium does contain something the Toh Empire lacks entirely. Inside the Inquisition sit the Recongregators, an organized faction holding inquisitorial authority, who believe the Imperium has become decadent and corrupt through millennia of stagnation, and that only through change can it hope to prosper. That is, almost word for word, the Toh diagnosis of the Imperium, held by people with the power to act on it, tolerated within the structure. The Toh Empire's equivalent internal critics are questioned by Ethereals on rumor and are not seen again, so the honest reading of this pair is uncomfortable and it does not resolve cleanly. The Tau system is more totalizing in what it demands of your interior. The Imperium tolerates far more ideological variety at its highest levels, and kills incomparably more people at every other level. 6th pair. What each empire does when it meets somebody who is not it. The Tau offer is genuine, and I want to give it in the canonical wordings rather than the fan compression, because the fan compression, join us or be destroyed, does not appear in canon anywhere. What exists is a spectrum. At the formal end, from a watercast negotiator addressing the Imperium directly, we offer you peace should you join us, and war should you prefer it. We await your response, for we recognize in your race beings of honor and courage. At the open end, the probe message broadcast into the Koath system in the 696th year of the 41st millennium. Stranger, I bid you greetings in the name of the Tar. We are 5 castes, 1 people. All are bound to the dream of bringing a new and better way to the universe. I hope you will choose to share the culture, technology and protection of the Tar Empire. The wise learn to adapt to change, and then the formulation that is the entire argument in miniature. Your people are plagued by the terrors we call the Mont'au, as we once were. We offer another path. Our way is unity, peace, reason and progress, and we offer it to all who crave it, whether they know it or not. Whether they know it or not. 7 words, and they are the exact point at which an offer stops being an offer. If you do not want this, that is evidence you have not understood it, and we will proceed. Commander Flamewing states the same thing more aggressively, calling the greater good a universal truth, and saying that to deny it is as arrogant, foolhardy, and ultimately futile as to deny the pull of gravity or the passage of time. Shazor Ralai states the consequence without decoration. The greater good demands that no obstacles stand in the way of the Tor. If we must, we will force your compliance at the point of a gun, and Aun'Va himself supplies the theology of it. It saddens me greatly that we must take arms against the peoples of the galaxy. By their deaths, they deny themselves the liberation that is only to be found in total surrender to the greater good. Their deaths are something they did to themselves, and the thing being offered is total surrender. That is the phrase he chose. The imperial position needs no such reconstruction, because the emperor wrote it himself. Suffer not the alien to live, in the archaic sense of suffer, meaning permit, meaning tolerate. Alongside it he issued orders for the extermination of all sapient xenos who could possibly threaten or influence humanity, and note the width of that word, influence. Xenophobia, ranging from suspicion to virulent and violent hatred, is deliberately cultivated in every part of the Imperium, and citizens are taught from a young age to fear and hate the xenos. And I want to be fair here too, because imperial xenophobia is not irrational. It is a trauma response to real events in this setting. The war in heaven, the fall of the Eldari, which tore open the eye of terror, betrayal by alien allies during the age of strife. The Imperium learned that lesson in blood, exactly as the Tau learned theirs from the Mont'au. 2 empires, 2 catastrophes, 2 opposite conclusions, but look at how each empire's exclusion list is actually shaped, because that is where the difference is real. The Tau have a category of being with whom no negotiation is possible, and it has 3 entries: orcs, tyrannids and chaos, and the orc entry is documented as a decision rather than a prejudice. Water caste delegates were massacred on Corvus and on Vaslan Prime, and after many attempts the Ethereals concluded that bargaining was impossible and withdrew the offer of the greater good from orcs as a matter of policy. That is a written-in exclusion in an ideology which claims every self-aware being is equal, and it is a genuine crack in the doctrine, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is 3 entries, arrived at by repeated failed attempts. The Imperium's exclusion list is the default setting for every species that is not human, with grudging, unofficial, career-endangering exceptions. Now the auxiliaries, honestly, because the Tar record here is genuinely mixed and both halves matter. The Kroot alliance began as an actual rescue. Orcs had overrun many Kroot worlds including Pek. Tau forces from Dal'yth relieved outnumbered Kroot on Krath, and a 10-year war called the War in the Place of Union reclaimed the Kroot core worlds. The Shaper Angkor Proc then swore allegiance at the sacred oathstone of Pek, and in the same breath demanded that Pek never be re-urbanized, and that the Kroot be allowed to resume their primal way of life. The Empire agreed. The Empire still honors it. That is a real concession against the Tau's own developmentalist instincts, and there is no equivalent anywhere in Imperial history. But read the service terms alongside it. The Kroot core worlds have fought loyally for the Tau and the greater good, provided they receive sufficient payment. Kindreds sit somewhere between mercenary companies, extended tribal families and nomadic warbands, and Kroot elders dispatch warriors across the galaxy to serve entirely different employers. And on cannibalism, the 7th edition codex from 2015 gives the exact posture. The habits of the Kroot are still tolerated, so long as they do not eat fallen Tau warriors. Their savagery is viewed with disdain by their Tau allies, and the stated Tau hope is that prolonged exposure to Tau sensibilities and culture will eventually purge them of the habit. That is tolerance with an expiry date. It is assimilationist, not pluralist. The Vespid are darker. The Tor could not communicate with them at all, and were incapable of getting the Vespid to even register that the Tor were fellow sapients. The Ethereal Caste ordered the Earth Caste to build an interface device, by a method that remains a mystery even among the Thor, and the Earth caste built it on instruction and did not retain the understanding of how. The moment the device was employed, the Vespid not only registered the Thor as fellow sapients, they instantly understood the concept of the greater good and their place within it. The 7th edition wording is blunter still. They suddenly became completely compliant, calmly accepting total annexation, and rumors have circulated ever since as to what true purpose the headsets serve. Only strain leaders wear them, and without one present the remaining stingwings become disoriented and unable to coordinate, and the will of the Ethereals is disseminated to the Vespid at large through the wearers. The Ordo Xenos theory is that the helm does not translate at all, that it attunes its wearer to the Tau worldview. Canon has never confirmed mind control, and I am not going to state it as fact. What Canon did do, in 2024, is give those helms a direct neural link to a Firecast handler. The solution to the difficulty of giving these aliens complex orders was to wire an alien commander's brain to a Tau officer, and then the Nikasar, who are the quietest indictment in the file, ursine, eyeless, sensing through psychic glands, and highly psychic in a species that is otherwise nearly warp-blind. Their ships have no real interstellar capability of their own, and are physically towed by Tau vessels, so the Empire supplies the exact thing that makes them useful. And, in Canon's own words, fearing that the Imperium's distrust of psychers would intensify their already dangerous xenophobia, the Tau have carefully kept them hidden from humans, an entire member species, managed as a diplomatic asset, its visibility adjusted for the audience. Compare that with how the Imperium powers its own interstellar navigation, which is the Astronomicon, sustained by 10,000 specially trained psychers whose life forces are exhausted within months, consuming the lives of 1,000 people every single day. Both empires solved faster than light travel using other people's souls. One burns them, the other tows them, and hides them, and does not mention them in the brochure. Which brings us to the humans who live under Tau rule, and this is where the whole comparison stops being theoretical. The word is gue'vesa, and it means literally, human helpers. The origin is not conversion, it is abandonment. When the Damocles Gulf Crusade broke off and the Imperial fleet withdrew, the redeployment stranded large numbers of Imperial Guard troops on Tau worlds. Commander Farsight followed the retreating fleet and offered the men left behind a straightforward binary: integration into the Tau Empire, or a bleak future as prisoners of war. Faced with the proposition of being stranded many light years from home in a hostile and foreign region, Canon says, many saw no alternative. So the founding gue'vesa population is a war-orphan population produced by their own empire's evacuation and a coerced choice made at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Hold that in mind before anyone calls them traitors. Their lives are documented in unusual detail. They live in frontier colonies, rather than integrated into Tau cities as equals. They are granted limited production capability, enough to manufacture anything from simple farming tools to a copy of the standard-issue Imperial lasgun, which means the humans of the Tau Empire build their own lasguns, because pulse weapons are not standard issue to them. In wartime that widens to pulse rifles, carbines, marker lights and grenades, but the equipment tends to be older material handed down from Tau line troops. They may keep the Imperial cult, and freedom to worship can be expected in most units and postings, but pressure to set the Emperor aside increases as a soldier rises through the ranks. Under Farsight specifically, humans kept a faith in the God Emperor purged of fanatic and xenophobic sentiments, which is to say a permitted and edited religion. New inductees are screened and given remedial therapy before entering an auxiliary academy, the named one being Kirkuth on Sarsia Sept, and only then reaching an active unit. That is an explicit ideological processing pipeline, written down, and then there is the ceiling, which is the real crux. They can never be members of a caste, because one must by definition be born into a caste to belong to it, and in a society where caste is the fundamental unit of meaning, being outside caste is being permanently outside everything. It is described as very rare for a human to rise to any sort of position of authority. The formulation that sums it up comes from Firecast by Peter Feravari, published in 2013, and it is that many Tau view the gue'vesa as more than mercenaries, but less than trusted allies. They are generally not deployed against Imperial forces, out of concern it would poison future diplomacy. They can be lied to by their own command, and they are, explicitly, a propaganda asset. The Tau show pictures of gue'vesa contentedly working in their new homes to other Imperial humans, as proof of the many benefits awaiting any Imperial citizen who devotes themselves to the greater good. A former Brimlock dragoon named Jicum Slovas fronted an entire campaign about humane treatment of prisoners. The Phylaxian defectors were deliberately dispersed across TO space so that their presence would function as a model. But something happens inside that arrangement which no propaganda office ordered, and it is the detail I keep coming back to. gue'vesa loyalty is performed physically and apparently by choice. Shaved heads, skin painted blue, TO symbols tattooed on, and, in the Wintertide Concordance, converted gue'vesa carved their commanders' snowflake heraldry into their own faces. Then some of the fire warriors began copying the practice, to the visible concern of their superiors. That is cultural exchange running backwards, from the subject population upward, into the ruling species, and nobody planned it, and the TO command did not like it. Their squads are called clusters. They address each other as friend, brother and sister, and their leaders are called first friend. Whatever that is, it is not what a conquered people usually sounds like, and the defections are the part the Imperium cannot answer. Captain Kalice Arkady of the Phylaxian 113th Irregulars was a decorated Astra Militarum officer, holding the Order of the Adamant Tread and the Crimson Skull. She defected, and she persuaded 109 of her guardsmen to come with her, and her stated reason was disillusionment with the Imperium and how it abused its own people. Not how it abused Xenos, its own people. That is a moral judgment rendered by a professional soldier with full working knowledge of both regimes, and she rose to gue'vesa in the Tau system afterwards, and she is not the extreme case. Inquisitor Lucien Vandire was abandoned on Dal'yth when the Crusade retreated, and the Tau turned him with words alone. The recorded argument is precise. They convinced him to reframe his oaths to the Imperium as oaths to humanity, and then argued that the Tau could better safeguard humanity into the future. He became gue'vesa Dal'yth Vadem, a Tau commander, piloting a crimson battlesuit built for a human frame, guarded by Tau, speaking Gothic with a Tau accent, and still bearing the symbol of the Inquisition branded into his forehead. That story is in the novella Broken Sword by Guy Haley, in the anthology Damocles, published in March 2014. The entire Watercast pitch is contained in that one substitution. Oath to the Imperium becomes oath to humanity, and it worked on an Inquisitor. The Imperium's reply to all of this is not an argument, it is a classification. The ecclesiarchy holds gue'vesa to be the worst kind of traitors to the Emperor, spiritually corrupted by the mere fact of association with Xenos, and Jicum Slovas was formally declared excommunicate traitorous. The rules of the game itself once encoded it, giving Imperial troops an automatic bonus to hit gue'vesa in close combat regardless of skill, which is hatred expressed as arithmetic. Note what is missing. Nowhere does the Imperium engage with why a decorated captain with 2 named honors walked. The answer would require admitting there was something to walk away from, which leaves the last pair, which is what each empire tells people about the other, and then the harder question of what each tells its own. Imperial propaganda about the Tau starts in childhood, since citizens are taught from a young age to fear and hate the Xenos, and guardsmen are specifically taught the superiority of mankind over all inhuman things. The doctrinal line on the greater good is genuinely good writing, and I will give the Imperium credit for it. Their obsessive pursuit of the so-called greater good, one Imperial source says, which would be rather more accurately translated into Gothic as the greater good of the Tau, and the warp take the rest. That is a sharp translation, and it is not entirely wrong. And the Imperial threat assessment tells you what the Imperium is actually afraid of, because it designates the water caste a higher threat than the fire and air castes combined, not the battle suits, the diplomats. Imperial strategists also note that only 6,000 Terran years have passed since Inquisitors first recorded that the Tau had just mastered fire and the wheel. The Imperium's fear is not that the Tau are strong, it is that they are improving, and the Imperium is not. Thor propaganda about the Imperium is tailored per audience, because the Watercast appeals to every level of Imperial society by emphasizing whichever aspect of the greater good that level lacks. technology to the engineers, an end to poverty and squalor to the hive workers, which is not a lie, since the 6th edition codex states there is nothing of the poverty or squalor within the empire that afflicts most other civilizations in the galaxy, protection to the frontier, and to the ideologically wavering, an escape from the brutality and corruption of imperial government. They bring standing units for this. The diplomatic corps deployed to Prefectia included an indigenous translation group, a population rehabilitation group, a worker transference group, and, remarkably, a dogma disproval group, whose function is arguing imperial subjects out of the Imperial Creed. The Earth Caste fielded a guerrilla active study group alongside them. The Tau bring an ideological conversion apparatus to the battlefield as standard establishment, the way another army brings artillery. And after the fall of Prefectia, the two empires wrote two incompatible histories of the same afternoon. Across the Tau Empire it was broadcast as their greatest victory yet, with watercast broadcasts running on loop for days to maximize the media value. The Imperium recorded it as a minor loss on a minor front. One battle, two official truths. Neither population will ever hear the other version, which brings us to the hardest part of this pair, which is what the Tau tell the Tau. Games Workshop's own material states it without hedging. Ethereals possess an absolute monopoly on the truth in the Tau Empire, which allows them to orchestrate grand campaigns of propaganda through their advanced communication technology, and then asks its own question. Good press is a powerful tool in their arsenal, but do they release the whole truth? And the answer, confirmed on the publisher's own site, is the single largest lie in the setting. The absurdly long lifespan of Ethereal Supreme Aun'Va has become part of his legend, and what the record actually says is that he is long dead, replaced with a hard light hologram and an advanced personality artificial intelligence. He was killed by a Culexus assassin in the ruins of Agrellan Prime, and canon notes that his end was neither swift nor merciful. The council covered it. They used the hologram to broadcast a victory speech after a defeat, and they issued new edicts to sustain the fraud so that it is now forbidden for anyone to touch Aun'Va, and his honor guard may never leave his side. Then there is the fourth sphere, and this is the one that should end the argument about whether the Tau are honest with their own people. The fourth sphere fleet's catastrophe was broadcast live across the entire Tau Empire as it happened, and the Ethereals then scrambled to contain all knowledge of the catastrophe, not to explain it, to contain it. Millions of Tau watched their fleet be devoured by something their entire materialist philosophy said could not exist, and then the state went to work erasing what they had all just seen together. Add the editing of the Seot, the Tau Book of Meditations, published in successive editions with meditations added and removed, including the quiet removal of a meditation by the hero Mont'au as the Empire's understanding evolved, and add Farsight, erased or recast as a coward. An empire that limits artificial intelligence on principle is currently having its next great expansion planned in a secret conclave convened in the name of a dead man simulated by an artificial intelligence, and the Supreme Ethereal will present that conclave's conclusion to the Council as his own reasoning. So both empires lie to their populations, but note the difference in what the lie is for, because it is not the same lie. The Imperium's foundational deception, the imperial truth, was a rationalist creed that denied the existence of the warp, told by an emperor who knew precisely what the warp was, in the hope that disbelief would starve the chaos gods of worship. It failed, and its failure produced the Horus heresy, and then a state religion worshipping the man who banned religion. The Tor deception is smaller, and more modern, and more manageable. It conceals a death, a disaster, and a defector, and it works, and it keeps working, and that is precisely the problem with it. There is one fact that sits underneath all 8 of these pairs, and it is the one that turns this from an argument into a war. In the 789th year of the 35th millennium, the Adeptus Mechanicus explorator ship Land's Vision found the Tor homeworld, catalogued its inhabitants as a Stone Age people who had mastered simple tools and fire, assessed them as harmless, and scheduled the world to be cleansed and colonized. The order was given. It was never carried out, because a warp storm sealed the planet away for roughly 6,000 years, and the age of apostasy destroyed the record. The Imperium did not spare the Tau, it forgot them. Everything that follows begins with a survey ship and a scheduling decision. In 789.M35, An Adeptus Mechanicus explorator vessel named the Land's Vision arrived above a dry blue world on the eastern fringe and began the ordinary work of cataloguing it. What the explorators found was a species that had mastered simple tools, simple weapons and fire, nothing else, no cities worth the name, no metallurgy worth recording, no capacity to leave the ground, let alone the atmosphere. The assessment written into the Imperial record was that these creatures were harmless, and then, having established that they were harmless, the Imperium scheduled the world to be cleansed and colonized. I want to sit inside that sentence for a moment, because the whole rest of this war lives in it. The very first Imperial policy toward the Tau was extermination, not deterrence, not quarantine, not observation. Extermination, ordered against a species that had done nothing, could do nothing, and did not know the Imperium existed. There was no provocation to respond to. There was no threat assessment that concluded danger. The threat assessment concluded the opposite, and the order was given anyway, because the doctrine does not require a reason. Suffer not the alien to live is not a security policy. It is a standing instruction, and the Tau received it before they had invented the wheel. What stopped it was weather. A violent warp storm closed around the system and sealed it off for something on the order of 6,000 years, and the fleet that was going to burn the Tau could not reach them. Then, while the storm held, the Imperium fell into the age of apostasy, and a century of religious civil war did what the storm could not finish. The record was lost. The order was never rescinded, because nobody remained who remembered issuing it. Understand what that means, because it matters for every argument the video has made so far. Canon does not describe an Imperium that showed mercy. Canon does not even describe an Imperium that changed its mind. It describes an administrative accident. The Tau survived to build a civilization because of a storm and a filing failure, and when the Imperium found them again, it found them across a gulf, industrialized, spacefaring, and already trading with Imperial fringe worlds. That second contact happened at Devlin, somewhere in the second half of the 41st millennium, and Canon does not give us the year, so neither will I. An unidentified Xenos vessel entered the system, failed to answer a naval challenge, and was destroyed. Adeptus Mechanicus Genetas recovered genetic material from the wreck and matched it against the Land's Vision records. The reaction recorded on the Imperial side is astonishment and apprehension, and those are exactly the right two words. A species catalogued as pre-industrial had crossed to the stars in under 6,000 years, and worse, from the Imperium's point of view, Imperial worlds had already been quietly doing business with them for some time. So the Ordo Hereticus went in and confirmed Tau activity throughout the region, and Cardinal Esau Gurney of Brimlock called for a crusade. The Damocles Gulf Crusade ran from 742 to 745.M41, and the force assembled for it tells you how seriously the Imperium took the problem. 12 capital starships, 5 provisional space marine companies drawn from nearly a dozen chapters, including Iron Hands, Ultramarines, Scythes of the Emperor, and Scar Lords, 19 Imperial Guard regiments, 7 of them raised from Brimlock alone, the Titan Legion Thanataris. Admiral Jollik held the fleet, General Wendell Gage held the ground forces, Iron Captain Marco Ruman led the Astartes contingent, and Inquisitor Grand of the Ordo Xenos came along carrying the authority to end a species. It opened with housekeeping. The Timbra subsector was reconquered, meaning the human colonies of Garrus and Caste, which had gone over to the Tau, were taken back and their collaborators seized and punished at a special assize held in front of the assembled crusaders. Note the choreography there. The trial was a performance staged for the fleet's own soldiers, and the message was aimed inward. At Hydas the Imperium met 7 Tau cruisers and got its first real shock, which was torpedo range. The Tau could reach further than they could. But the same battle handed the Imperium the weakness that would define the entire naval war, and it is a simple one. Tau ships carry very little heavy broadside firepower, close the distance, get alongside, and they cannot answer. Every Imperial admiral in the Gulf spent the next 2 centuries trying to do exactly that. At Silkel, an agri-world of roughly 7 million Tau, the Imperium learned what a Tau ground war costs. Highly mobile mechanized infantry that would not stand and be shelled. Battle suits dropping out of nowhere into the flanks of an advance and gone before the counterfire landed. hammerhead gunships assessed by the Imperium's own officers as a match for the Lehman Russ, and the Thor response to losing the world was itself instructive. They did not defend it to the last. They evacuated their key Earth caste personnel and let the ground go. The alien population that could not be lifted was exterminated, and the world was claimed. Then Viscil. And Viscil is the one I would put on screen if I could only choose a single frame of this entire crusade. It was an ice world, holding nothing but tall fishery colonies, assessed by imperial planners as having no strategic value whatsoever, not a shipyard, not a garrison, not a route, fishermen. The Imperium bombarded it from orbit anyway, and the bombardment melted the polar caps, and the colonies were destroyed in flash floods, and all life on the world was purged. There was no advantage in it, there was no target. A world was killed for tidiness, because it was there, and because the doctrine says that a place where aliens live is a place that should stop existing. If anyone ever asks you what the Imperial Creed actually looks like when it is applied rather than recited, the answer is a drowned fishing colony on an ice world nobody wanted. Prayan was different, and it changed the temperature of the war. The Thor had emplaced heavy railguns and committed 11 ships. The Imperial capital ship Regent Lakshimbol was destroyed with all hands. A Kroot warsphere came out of concealment and drove straight at the troop transports, which is a nightmare no Imperial admiral plans for. The Imperium won it, and paid 4 capital ships and 14 escorts for the privilege, and something happened in the aftermath that the Imperium very rarely permits itself. The Crusade began to respect the enemy, not fear it, respect it. That sentiment, forming in the minds of Imperial officers at Prayan, is the reason the Tau species still exists. Because at Dal'yth Prime, the entire advance came apart. Long-range fire broke up the spearheads before they made contact. Jump troops with cloaking fields hit the flanks and vanished. Manta gunships came down on the Titans and neutralized the Imperium's heaviest asset. Kroot fought from the rooftops of Tau cities, which is a thing Kroot do disturbingly well. Crisis battlesuits bled the line. All 3 Imperial spearheads stalled, and then the nights began, and superior Tau night vision turned every hour of darkness into a slow hemorrhage of Imperial soldiers who could not see the things shooting them. And it was there, with the Crusade stuck in the mud of a world it could not take, that Inquisitor Grand of the Ordo Xenos stood up in a council of war and demanded Exterminatus. His argument was clean, and by Imperial logic it was correct. Evacuate the Imperial forces, then destroy Dal'yth Prime entirely, on the explicit grounds that the Tau were too dangerous a species to be allowed to continue to exist. Not too dangerous to be allowed to hold this planet, too dangerous to exist. He had watched a pre-industrial people reach the stars in 6,000 years. He had watched them outrange, outmaneuver and outthink the Imperium's finest for 3 years, and he drew the only conclusion his office allows: kill it now while it is small. He was opposed. The Council of War was paralyzed by the argument, and canon is precise about where the opposition came from, so let me be precise too. The Imperials had found the Tau to be honorable adversaries, and there was marked opposition to such an extreme course of action within the Crusade's high command, especially from the Astartes. Space Marines argued against exterminating a Xena species on the grounds of honor. In this setting, that is close to unprecedented, and it is on the page, and I think it is the single most important 30 seconds in the entire 100-year war, because it is the moment the Imperium proves it is not one thing. The Inquisition wanted a species gone. The Emperor's own angels of death said no, these people have fought us fairly, and we will not do this. And the argument was not resolved by principle. It was resolved by a deadlock so total that nothing happened at all. Then the astropaths brought in the message that ended everything. In late 745.M41, an express order arrived from Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman carrying news of the first Tyranid attacks. Hive Fleet Behemoth had arrived in the galaxy. Resistance to withdrawal from the Inquisition and the Adeptus Astartes was overruled, and the Crusade was ordered home, which is where the Tar did the thing that keeps this whole comparison alive. General Gage forced the river line and took the starport at Gelbrin, and he used it not to press the attack but to evacuate. The Watercast opened negotiations under parley. Flags of truce were raised and honored by both sides. The Imperial fleet withdrew unmolested. And canon states plainly that the Tar could have blockaded the Gulf and destroyed the trapped Crusade where it stood, and chose dialogue instead. They had the Imperium's fleet in a bottle and they let it go. The record says the first seeds of cooperation between the two empires were sown at that moment. As to who won, the sources genuinely disagree, and I will not pretend otherwise. Lexiconum records an indecisive negotiated settlement. The fandom wiki records an imperial strategic victory. They agree entirely on the facts, and disagree only on the label, and the defensible formulation is that the Imperium achieved its strategic aim, failed operationally, and left by agreement. The aftermath is uglier than the war. The Inquisition descended on every human world that had so much as traded with the Tau, and delivered harsh punishments and purges to everyone who had collaborated. Which is to say that the Imperium responded to the discovery that its citizens liked the aliens by punishing the citizens, and thereby manufactured, at scale, the very population of human defectors it feared. And Canon's own summary of the entire Crusade is bleak and worth quoting as it stands. It simply marked the start of over 200 standard years of brutal warfare. 200 years later, one Tau commander went back through the records and concluded that the Crusade had never been a defeat at all. Commander Farsight worked out, in 998.M41, that the entire Damocles Gulf Crusade had been an execution of the Canon, the Patient Hunter, by Aun'Va and the Ethereal Council. On this reading, the Thor deliberately goaded the Imperium into attacking, at a moment of their choosing, before the humans could grasp the true scale of the Thor Empire, in order to win a heartening victory and to teach a young species that the Imperium could be fought. The bait was real. The dead at Vissel and Silkel were real. They were also, if Farsight is right, budgeted for. And then Farsight added that conclusion to the list of things he would keep from the Tar population for the greater good. A dissident concealing the truth about a concealment, using the ideology's own justification to do it. The enclaves are not outside the system. They are the system, wearing different colors. Between the Crusade and the modern war sit the spheres of expansion, and the shape of them tells you more than any battle. The first sphere ran from 502.M37 to 956.M38, entirely at sublight speed, and produced 7 septs. Tom Dianoi, Borkan, Dal'yth, Falshia, Viorla and Satia. It ended not in defeat but in arithmetic, because sublight transit meant a Tau could not cross the Empire within a lifetime. The Imperial response to the first sphere was nothing. There was no response. The Imperium was not aware it was happening. An alien empire acquired 7 sept worlds while the species that had ordered its extermination had forgotten it existed. The second sphere was declared by Aun'Va and launched simultaneously from every first sphere world, integrated the Vespid, built the first prototype battlesuits, made Commander Puritide's reputation and ended by crossing the Damocles Gulf. Its most interesting moment, though, is a joint one. When Hive Fleet Gorgon arrived between 899 and 903.M41, it was destroyed by combined Tar and Imperial Guard forces, fighting together, on purpose. The third sphere was declared by Aun'Va and run by Shadowsun, with better engines and stasis chambers giving reach the earlier spheres never had. Shadowsun's method was a dozen separate fleets on a dozen headings, striking and withdrawing faster than Imperial Command could correlate the reports. Water Caste agents mobilized gue'vesa for reconnaissance. Some Imperial worlds simply surrendered on first sight. And the third sphere's greatest strategic asset was not a weapon at all. It was the 13th Black Crusade, which pulled the Imperium's attention to Cadia and kept it there. Which brings us to Agrellan, and to the chain of consequences that I think is the strongest single argument this entire subject contains. The Second Agrellan Campaign, 999.M41. The Imperium committed Task Force Retribution, which is a genuinely enormous instrument. 18 infantry regiments, 6 armored, 2 artillery, 2 rough rider, abhuman auxilia, 3 militarim tempestus airborne wings, Raven Guard, White Scars, Skituri, House Terran Knights, Lord General Troska, Lord Admiral Hawk, Kavan Shrike, Corisaro Khan, High King Tybalt, against Shadowsun, against Aun'Va in person, and, extraordinarily, alongside them, Commander Farsight and the 8, the schismatics fighting for the empire that had disowned them, and the Imperium brought an officio assassinorum execution force, with a stated doctrine that deserves to be said out loud. Even if Agrellan could not be liberated, the Mont'au would lose their best and brightest leaders. The war was lost, so kill the future. A Vindicar took the shot on Farsight, and Commander Bravestorm stepped into it. Darkstrider brought the Vindicar down and lost every one of his elite Pathfinders doing it. An Eversaw came for Farsight and Oblotia 9-0 engaged it and was badly damaged buying the opening. A Calidus wearing the face of the Ethereal Aun'Va walked into Shadowsun's mobile command post and wounded her before she and her bodyguard killed it. And a Calexus found Aun'Va, the Ethereal Supreme, hidden in a bunker beneath the ruins of Agrellan Prime, mentally overwhelmed his entire honor guard and killed him. Canon's words. His end was neither swift nor merciful. The Imperium still lost. The White Scar's third company was recalled to Chogoris. Troska was relieved, and his replacement ordered a full withdrawal. And this is where the chain begins, so follow every link, because not one of them is speculation. Link 1. With the evacuation already complete, with no Imperial soldiers left to save and no military objective remaining, Admiral Hawke performed Exterminatus on Agrellan. The method was a specialized torpedo that set the planet's gaseous northern hemisphere alight, and it burned millions of Tau along with the human population left behind. The Earth Caste got a shield up over a single city, Lovash Tau, whose survivors were left under a dome on a burning world with the understanding that they might never see the Empire again. There was nothing to gain. The world was lost. This was a torpedo fired out of spite by a defeated admiral on his way home, and the Imperium never punished him for it. Compare that to a Tau empire that recalled Commander Brightsword to answer for a massacre, and later put its own Fourth Sphere commanders through the Malkla for war crimes. One of these empires investigates itself. Link 2. The Adeptus Mechanicus then set the entire Damocles Gulf ablaze. Not a world. The Gulf, a whole region of space, deliberately rendered impassable to physically separate the two empires, in an act that canon says may have ripped the Great Rift wider than it would otherwise have gone. The Imperium's answer to losing a campaign was to burn the map. Link 3. That closed the Tau Empire's primary expansion route, and the Tau were now boxed in on every axis. Forward, the burning Gulf. East, the dead zone Hive Fleet Gorgon had left behind. West, the Necron Sortek dynasty. And then the Great Rift tore open and its stellar storms began killing Tau by the million. Link 4. Boxed in, the Ethereal Council gambled. They authorized the AL-38 Slipstream module, an antimatter-powered faster-than-light drive developed from years of studying salvaged Imperial warp technology. Read that again slowly. A species with no psychers, no navigators, no theology of the warp, and no framework for understanding it at all, reverse engineering warp travel from Imperial wreckage, because the Imperium had left them nowhere else to go. A fourth sphere was declared under Commander Shorestrike, and the Armada gathered at Numenor Point. Link 5. The fleet was too large. Every slipstream module activating at once produced multiple simultaneous disruptions of reality. The antimatter fields chain reacted, and the result tore a massive wound in real space that swept across the fleet and devoured it whole. It was broadcast live across the entire Tau Empire, and the Ethereals then scrambled to suppress all knowledge of what their citizens had just watched happen. Link 6, and this is the one that produces the atrocities. 3/4 of the fleet was destroyed inside the warp by entities the Tau had no vocabulary for, and the demons did not attack evenly. They swarmed the mercenary and auxiliary vessels and largely ignored the purely Tau-crewed ships, because Tau souls barely register in the warp, while their allies' souls blazed like beacons. The Nikasar vessel suffered worst, with demons swarming it like alkali gnats. So the surviving Tau watched, for weeks, as hell passed over their own hulls to devour the aliens they had promised to protect. Then something in the warp saved them, a many-armed entity that canon calls the goddess Tau'Va, believed to be a nascent god formed as a psychic echo of the greater good itself, with arms shaped as Tau, human, Kroot, Nikasar and Charpactin, and the auxiliary species began openly worshipping it, and the fourth sphere Tau were filled with disgust and dismay. A materialist atheist empire generated a god, and it was the aliens who knelt. Link 7. The fourth sphere Tau concluded that the entity had been formed out of their auxiliaries' faith in the greater good, and that it could therefore only be killed by exterminating those auxiliaries. That is the reasoning, and it comes from War of Secrets by Phil Kelly, 2018. Put it beside what they had watched in the warp, and you have a fleet that came home certain their allies were the wound, and then they did it. The massacre of the Dulon Lakes, the 8 days of infamy, the slaughter at Salkio, the Filial Station bloodshed, and the killings at Kaisan. Human prisoners massacred, auxiliaries knowingly spent in battles they were not meant to survive, rumors, which canon leaves as rumors, of mass expulsions and executions of every non-Tor in the surviving fleet. The last of those atrocities is described as far beyond every necessity of war, and canon states that they haunted Shadowsun and the Ethereal High Council. That is the chain, unbroken, link by link, and here is what it amounts to. The Imperium's single most destructive act against the Tau Empire, a spite exterminatus performed after the fighting had already stopped, is the direct and traceable cause of the Tau Empire's own worst atrocities, committed with technology salvaged from Imperial ships by a fleet that had been forced into the warp because the Imperium burned the only road they had. The Imperium did not merely fail to exterminate the Tau, it taught them, and the Kaisan response tells you where the Tau ideology actually breaks. After the Kroot uprising, all auxiliaries were removed from Fourth Sphere contingents. The greater good's answer to Tau soldiers murdering their alien allies was to take the aliens away from them, the multi-species army, segregated by species, to protect it from itself, which brings us to the men and women at the top of this, and to what the Empire does to them. Commander Puritide was, by canon's own assessment, the most gifted Tau commander who ever lived, the man who wrote the book on Firecast tactics. His 3 great pupils, Farsight, Shadowsun and Caste, trained together on Dal'yth and survived Mount Kanji together, and all 3 were selected by the Ethereals for cryogenic freezing so that they could be kept for later use. Think about that phrasing for a second. 3 of the finest minds their species produced, put into storage as strategic assets. Then Puritide grew old and died, and before he did, the Earth Caste scanned his brain and encoded portions of his genius into implantable biochips, which are surgically inserted into the brains of serving Firecast commanders. And canon gives us 2 details about those chips that I do not think enough people sit with. The first, when the engram chips were removed, they left the commander's brain dead, not impaired, brain dead. Once it goes in, it is not coming out. The second, and it is worse. Once implanted with a sword of Puritide neurochip, a commander could not draw upon any of their own previous strategic knowledge. Everything they had learned, everything they had personally survived, sealed off and unreachable, replaced by a dead man's recorded instincts. And that failure mode showed up on real battlefields, because Puritide never faced a psyker, so his chips have nothing to say about psykers, and the commanders wearing his mind faltered badly against them, with the confusion costing hundreds of lives. Here is where I think the record actually shows the greater good at its most naked. The Tau Empire needed better generals. Its solution was to record a dead man's mind and write it over living officers, permanently, at the cost of everything they knew. That is the Talisera principle taken to its endpoint. Shed your individual identity in favor of your function. Only this time it is not a bonding ritual and a shared meal. It is neurosurgery. Farsight refused. His own trajectory runs from the defense of Dal'yth to an expedition to reclaim lost colonies with a trio of ethereals, and then to the dead world of Arthas Moloch, where blood spilled on a strange altar summoned chaos demons, where he nearly died, and where he found the Dawn Blade, a weapon older than the Imperium forged by unknown Xenos from materials the Earth Caste cannot fathom. The blade is chronophagic. Every life it cuts short is added to its wielder's own, which is why Farsight has lived for nearly 3 centuries in a species whose lifespan is measured in decades. And now aware that chaos exists, he came to see the Ethereal's guidance as something else entirely, control. He denounced the priesthood and declared independence. What exactly he learned at Arthas Moloch, canon does not say. It has never said. Farsight, Empire of Lies, Phil Kelly, 2020, has him return to that world, discover the real story behind the defining moment of his life, and end up torn between the greater good and the hideous truth about the nature of the galaxy, after which he gives up his battlesuit and the Dawnblade and hands the enclaves to the Eight. That is the trajectory. The revelation itself is withheld, deliberately, and I am not going to invent one. And Shadowsun is the counterweight to all of it, because she is the Empire's most loyal servant, and it is documented repeatedly that she quietly disagrees with it. She disciplined the Fourth Sphere's war criminals. Their atrocities haunted her. She personally hunted down and killed the White Scar's Stormseer Sudabe at Voltoris, and when the Ethereal Council ordered her to apprehend Farsight, she accepted the task loyally but reluctantly, and then she leaked the order to him beforehand and gave her old ally a head start. Which leaves Aun'Va, and the fact that everything the Tau Empire has done since 999.M41 has been done in the name of a corpse. He died in that bunker under Agrellan Prime. A Kulexis killed him, and it was neither swift nor merciful. And the Ethereal Council did not announce it. They used holograms to broadcast a victory speech in his name after the loss of Mugulath Bay, and then they made the arrangement permanent, replacing the Ethereal Supreme with a hard-light hologram driven by an advanced personality artificial intelligence encoded with his thought patterns. Lexicanum lists his species as Tar, Former, and Artificial Intelligence. Games Workshop's own official article states it plainly, and then asks the obvious question: if they cannot even be honest about that, what else are they hiding? To sustain it, new edicts were issued. It is now forbidden for anyone to touch Aun'Va. His honor guard may never leave his side. An empire that limits artificial intelligence on principle, run by a species that believes it has no religion, is being led by a simulation of a dead priest that its citizens are legally prohibited from putting a hand through. And then it got theological. During the Arcs of Omen campaign, that projection appeared to Farsight on Arthas Moloth and told him he was cursed for turning his back on the greater good, and that all his people stood condemned alongside him. The Empire's greatest living soldier was excommunicated by a dead man's software. The Sixth Sphere expansion, the war that is launching now, was decided in a secret conclave convened in that same name, and the sources disagree on whether it was the hologram or the council that called it, so treat the attribution as unsettled. The artificial intelligence is confirmed. Who convened the room is not. So here is the verdict, and I have been building toward it for 4 movements, so let me state it without hedging. Both empires make the identical offer: obedience in exchange for survival. Give up your right to choose, and we will keep you alive. That is the Imperial Creed's 5th tenet, and it is the Tauva's founding bargain, and neither empire is embarrassed about it, because both of them were built out of a real apocalypse, and both of them genuinely believe the apocalypse comes back the moment obedience slips. The difference is that the Tau honor the deal, and the Imperium does not. A world that joins the Tau Empire gets what it was promised. Canon is explicit that there is nothing of the poverty or squalor that afflicts most other civilizations of the galaxy. The technology works. The medicine works. The protection actually protects. Religion is permitted, conditionally. The soldiers are given real tactical autonomy and an explicit doctrine against pointless martyrdom, and an air caste pilot who judges a battle unwinnable is trusted to leave. A beaten Imperial fleet at Dal'yth was allowed to withdraw under a flag of truce that was honored. The Kroot bargain has been kept for millennia. War criminals were recalled and tried. A world that stays with the Imperium gets a tithe grade. At the upper grades, entire societies may be legally consumed, their populations reduced to laborers, and their resources extracted until the world collapses. The lights are kept on by 1,000 psychers burned alive every day to run a navigational beacon. Criminals are lobotomized and bolted into machinery. Industrial workers die in their 30s without ever having seen the sky. Guardsmen are expendable by written policy. Prisoners are recruited with the explicit promise of almost certain death, and the man who decides a battle is unwinnable is shot by a political officer in front of his friends. 3 loyal Imperial worlds, Argoth, Kagaran and Relus, were condemned entire on suspicion of sympathy by a Lord Commander whose stated doctrine was that the purges shall continue until their loyalty is total. They obeyed. It did not save them. That is the deal, broken in writing. Now the counterweight, immediately, because an argument that hides its own weakest point is not an argument. The Tor price is that you may never be free. Caste mobility is not difficult, it is canonically impossible, held contrary to the notions of the greater good itself, and crossing the line is one of the most grievous crimes the Empire recognizes. The castes are forbidden to interbreed and are diverging further every generation by deliberate policy, which means the cage is being welded shut biologically, on purpose, over time. If you are not Tau, you will never hold a caste at all, only a parallel and inferior ladder that runs alongside the real one and never joins it. Dissent has its own noun, Raukna. Re-education facilities return people described as drooling dogs. Councils of Ethereals are dispatched on the strength of rumor alone, and few who are questioned are seen again, and the priesthood conceals nearly everything, up to and including the death of its own supreme leader. So let me be as explicit as I know how. This video argues that the Thor deliver on their promise. It does not argue that the Thor are good. Those are different claims, and only one of them is defensible. An empire can keep every word of a contract that should never have been offered. The Thor built a cage with the bars labeled, published the ranks, put your caste in your name, and then made absolutely certain you could never leave it. The Imperium built a cage, told you it was the sky, and then failed to feed you. And there is a genuine point on the Imperial side that fairness demands, which is that the Imperium has never claimed its subjects are happy. Its brutality is not disguised as care. It contains organized reformists inside its own secret police, recongregators holding inquisitorial authority while arguing that the Imperium is stagnant and must change, which is an internal pluralism the Thor Empire does not possess in any form. And it has real escape hatches, the Astartes and the Schola, and the Inquisition, by which a hive-born child can genuinely become something else. The Thor caste system forbids that structurally. It cannot happen. It has never happened. There are also things canon simply does not answer, and I would rather leave them open than pretend. Where the Ethereals came from is unknown. They appeared as from nowhere, mid-apocalypse, in matched pairs, with anatomy no other Thor possesses, and no edition has ever given them an origin. How their authority actually works is unknown. There is a dissected ethereal corpse, and a living captive ethereal, and between them they have produced no functioning biological mechanism, and Games Workshop's own article footnotes the question with the line that the Ethereals know, and they aren't telling. Whether the Ethereals believe their own doctrine is unknown. Whether they are sincere or cynical is precisely the thing the record refuses to settle. What Farsight found at Arthes Moloch is unknown. What happens to the people who are never seen again, the failed fire caste children and the questioned sympathizers and the re-educated, is unknown, and canon uses the passive voice every single time it approaches the subject, which is a choice. How a Stone Age species crossed 6 millennia of development in 6,000 years is unknown, and the entire canonical explanation is the sentence that the Ethereals evidently had some part to play. What became of the Fourth Sphere's auxiliaries is unknown, and canon says outright that it has since become a mystery, which is more damning than any stated figure would be. What happened to Governor Upher-Aulis of Taros, the one imperial governor who chose the Tau and won, is unknown. No one knows, and whether the Sixth Sphere launches across the Damocles Gulf or out of the Nemyar Atoll is undecided as of the most recent codex, which leaves the one thing the Ethereals have actually told us, twice in writing. In Fire Warrior, by Simon Spurrier, 2003, an Ethereal reveals to the Fire Warrior Kais that the greater good does not really exist, that the Tar will never achieve it fully, and that the important thing is the reaching for the ideal and not the attainment of it. That is said to a loyal soldier, by his own priest, in the middle of a war being fought for it. In Xenology, by Simon Spurrier, 2006, a captured Ethereal is asked by an Imperial interrogator whether the Torvar is achievable, and answers, of course not. What is? The Torvar is the path, gue'vesa, not the destination. That is said to an enemy, in captivity, with nothing to gain. 2 different Ethereals, 2 different books, 3 years apart, one speaking to an interrogator who wants him dead, and one speaking to a young man who would die on his word. The same admission, word for word in substance, that is not a slip of the tongue, and it is not a character being clever. Twice, independently, is doctrine. No imperial priest has ever conceded that the emperor might not protect. Not once, in 10,000 years, in any source. The ecclesiarchy has never admitted that salvation may be out of reach, because admitting it would end the ecclesiarchy. The Ethereals admit it, and the Empire runs anyway. And every other thing they hide serves that same admission. Aun'Va's corpse behind the hologram, the fourth sphere catastrophe broadcast live and then buried, Farsight rewritten into a coward, the Seot scripture quietly edited between editions, dropping the words of the hero Mont'au because the Empire's understanding had evolved. Every one of those deceptions exists to keep trillions of beings walking a road that the priesthood has privately conceded has no end. So the question that closes this is not whether the Tau are the good guys, because they are not, and it is not whether the Imperium is worse, because on the evidence assembled it plainly is. The question is what to do with a priesthood that told the truth about the only thing that mattered, and lied about everything else in order to protect it. Is a priesthood that concedes its promise is unreachable more honest than one that never does, or is it infinitely more sophisticated, having discovered that the most durable lie is the one wrapped around a confession? I am not going to answer that. Canon does not answer it, and every source that gets close to answering it stops deliberately at the edge, and I think that restraint is the point. We have the Emperor on the golden throne, a corpse animated by machinery to keep an empire running, and Aun'Va in his Hall of Light, a corpse simulated by software to keep an empire running. 10,000 years apart, one galaxy, two dead men governing trillions who are not permitted to know they are dead. Both empires offered obedience in exchange for survival. Only one of them has ever admitted that the thing it promised was never going to arrive.